Chapter 568, Count Jingan is returning. 1. Perhaps due to her overnourishment, Chu Lian was especially energetic this night. The couple kept at it all through the night. Even the experienced senior servant Zhong, who was on duty in the side room, couldn't help blushing over the noises she heard. The next day, Chu Lian slept in until the sun was high in the sky. She turned to one side without thinking and was suddenly reacquainted with all the sore parts of her body, especially her waist. When her eyes flickered open and her mind started to wake, the scenes from last night played in her head one by one. Chu Lian's face turned bright red and she hugged the warm blankets to herself as she beat the bed with her fists. Regret washed over her in waves. How could Changdi do that? He had actually hid the truth from her. No wonder she had felt that something was strange with her body these few days. She even thought that Sanlang had become a herbivore, but he was actually a sheep in wolf's clothing. Thinking of the nourishing tonic she had readily drunk over the past few days, Chu Lian felt that she was a lamb being fattened for slaughter. The crazy passion they had shared last night made Chu Lian wish she could spontaneously erase all her memories. Where did Changdi learn all those shameful poses? She pulled the covers over her face and hid like an ostrich with its head in the sand. However, the sounds of footsteps outside the bedchamber made her get up again. She took in a deep breath and rubbed at her warm cheeks. When she felt calm again, she asked, "What time is it?" Wenlan was standing by the bed. When she heard the question, she immediately replied, "Third young madam, it's almost the 11th hour of the morning." Chu Lian stiffened up. She threw back the blankets and leapt up in a single instant. Wenlan quickly added on after hearing the noises, "Third young madam, please don't worry. Third young master has already informed the matriarch and the countess before he left this morning. You don't have to greet them today." Chu Lian blinked and let out her anxiety in a single breath. Although her relations with the matriarch had already soured, she still had to do what was required as a junior member of the family. If she was lacking in her etiquette, it would reflect badly on her instead. Luckily, Changdi had already taken care of that for her. Third young master went to the Ministry of War and he said he would return in the afternoon. "Would you like to get up now, third young madam?" Chu Lian lifted the bed curtains and told Wenlan to bring her clothes. When she finished washing up and sat at the table for breakfast, she seemed to have the strange feeling that the servants were looking at her with knowing expressions, coupled with teasing glints. She couldn't sit still. It felt like she had done something wrong. After she was done with breakfast, Countess Jingan even specially came over to Songtao Court to visit her with a bowl of soup. The obvious intentions of her mother-in-law gave Chu Lian the urge to pummel Changdi to get rid of all the embarrassment welling up within her. However, she was still happy to see that Countess Jingan had become well enough to visit her. "Mother, do you feel any discomfort in your body now?" Since her health had improved, her mood had never been better. The current Countess Jingan had filled out a little. Her cheeks were now rosy with the pink of health. The Countess shook her head with a smile, "Not at all, imperfectly healthy. I can eat well and sleep well. I never dared to dream of recovering my body to this state before." Countess Jingan had spent many years bedridden still. Even though the root of her illness had been cured, she was still a little more fragile than most. She would have to be careful not to expend too much energy in the future. However, compared to her condition a few months ago, this was a vast improvement. She was already very content with what she had now. She had been expecting to spend the rest of her life in bed before this. Chapter 569, Count Jingan is returning. 2. Sanlang's wife had been the one to bring Great Dr. Miao to the Jingan estate. It had also been Sanlang and his wife who had traveled thousands of miles, risking their lives in the north, to retrieve the key to her recovery, the Snow Mountain Mist's flower. Chu Lian was definitely high in the list of people that Countess Jingan was thankful for. "My husband and I are thrilled that mother has gotten better. I'm sure father will be equally happy once he finds out." When Chu Lian mentioned her father-in-law, Madame Liu suddenly remembered some news. Her lips curved upwards and a warm smile blossomed on her face. Changdi's lips were the most similar to his mother's, thin in shape, but not in feeling. "Liana, I'm afraid you haven't heard this yet. Your father will be returning from Mingju soon. If I count the days, he must be on his way already." Chu Lian's eyes sparkled. Her father-in-law was on the way back to the capital. This was happening half a year earlier than in the original novel. She had already married into House Jingan for more than 6 months, but she hadn't met her father-in-law yet. Madame Liu seemed to have sensed her daughter-in-law's surprise and uncertainty. She reassured with a smile, "There's no need to be scared. Dalang is the one who resembles your father the most amongst my 3 sons. While your father might look a little fierce, has a softy inside. He loves doting on the younger generation the most." Madame Liu's description gave Chu Lian a good guess at her father-in-law's appearance. She lost a little of her trepidation and started looking forward to meeting her father-in-law instead. Countess Jingan didn't stay for long. She soon headed back to her own courtyard with her handmaids in tow. Chu Lian took a nap in the afternoon. When she woke up, it was to the sight of Changdi reading a book while leaning against the headboard. She rubbed her eyes and glared at Sanlang. He seemed to have noticed her movements from the corner of his eyes. He reached out with one hand to pet her on the head. "Have you slept enough?" Chu Lian wanted to scold him for getting too greedy last night and going on until she almost fainted over. However, just as she was about to speak, her bashfulness overcame her and she stopped. In the end, she expressed her feelings by giving him a good pinch on the arm. Sanlang's brow wasn't even ruffled by the attack. When she was done taking out her frustration on him, he turned to look at her. He unexpectedly took her hand into his and reached into his clothes, setting her hand down on the prominent muscles on his abdomen. "Pinch here. Your hand will hurt from pinching my arm." Chu Lian was utterly defeated by his shamelessness. She gave him one last ferocious pinch. Unfortunately, his abdomen wasn't soft either and it was taxing on her fingers. On the other hand, Changdi stiffened up from her actions. A dangerous glint had seeped into his eyes when their gazes met again. Chu Lian quickly let go out of fright. She didn't dare to provoke him again. He was definitely a shameless man through and through. The one who would suffer instead was her. Sanlang knew that she had been completely tired out from last night, so he hadn't thought of playing with her again. He secretly doused the rising flames of desire within him before reaching out to draw Chu Lian into his arms. He stroked her hair tenderly and slowly, giving the impression of soothing an affectionate cat. A comfortable haze fell over Chu Lian from his warm actions. She leaned against his shoulder amiably and even twirled a lock of his long hair between her fingers. "Oh, right. Mother mentioned some news when she came by to visit in the afternoon. Father will be returning from Mingju." Changdi's eyes hadn't shifted from his book, but he let out a light grunt of acknowledgement. "After some time," he said, "it's due to a secret decree that the Emperor sent out some time back. I just found out 2 days ago. What could the Emperor's intentions be?" Thoughts flew by in Chu Lian's head. Her father-in-law, Count Jingan, had been stationed at the border in Mingju for over a decade. While the current political state in court meant that military officials couldn't be compared to the literary officials, it was different for the generals who defended the borders. House Jingan was only a countship, but no one in the capital dared to look down upon them because of her father-in-law, Count Jingan, guarding the border of Mingju. There were at least 60,000 soldiers under Count Jingan's command, twice the number of Liangzhou's troop. Chapter 570. Don't Seduce Me. 1. Although the southern border at Mingju was stable, it didn't mean that skirmishes didn't happen. The environment of those living beyond the southern border was horrid, so the people there had been coveting the fertile lands of the Great Wu dynasty for ages. There was only one reason why the emperor would call the defender of the border back at this time. He wanted to prop Changdi up. He was going to do this by slowly taking away the powers of Count Jingan, transferring the influence that the He family had in the imperial court to Changdi. Otherwise, if the He family collected too much power, it wouldn't be a good thing for the imperial court. Count Jingan was already 50. That was rather old for an officer. Furthermore, he had spent years away from his family, so it was time for him to return to the capital and spend the remainder of his life in peace. Sanlang stared at her clear almond-shaped eyes and smiled. "Have you figured out the reason yet?" Chu Lian blinked at him. "The emperor intends to entrust you with greater responsibility." Changdi raised his hand to pinch her soft and rosy cheeks. "You're pretty smart." Chu Lian puffed up her cheeks and escaped from his evil clutches. When my holiday ends, all the matters regarding the Department of Appointments will become my responsibility. When that time comes, I won't have as much time to spend with you. I don't need your company, Chu Lian softly retorted. He Changdi tossed the book in his hand aside. He suddenly lowered his body and held her down with one leg. His warm breath washed over her ear as he said, "Are you sure you don't need my company?" His aggressive move caused Chu Lian's face to flush red. Afraid that he would do something naughty, she used both arms to push back against his solid chest. "You're too heavy. Don't squash me, it's uncomfortable." He Sanlang noticed that his body was reacting to her actions, but knowing that she was likely too tired from what had happened last night, he endured it. He lightly pecked the side of her lips and said, "Don't seduce me." Chu Lian was feeling very wronged. She hadn't even done anything at all. How was that considered an attempt at seducing him? She glared at him with her wide, watery eyes, but he Changdi covered them with his wide palm. He pressed his lips together, gritted his teeth, and said, "I just told you not to seduce me. Stop, or I'll do you right here and now." Chu Lian. He Changdi reverted back to his original relaxed position against the headboard. He took out an envelope from his sleeves and handed it to his wife. Chu Lian sat up, crossed her legs, and leaned against him. With a confused look, she stared at the envelope. "A letter. Who is it from?" She was only wearing a thin brown robe. Although the room was heated and it wasn't cold, he Sanlang was still worried that she would feel chilly, so he pulled up the blanket to cover her legs and said, "It isn't a letter. Open it up and see." Chu Lian was suspicious, but she still took the envelope and opened it. There were 2 booklets inside. When she took them out, she could feel that they were made of high-quality paper. Once she flipped them open, she realized that they were deeds. The deeds were for a storefront situated in an excellent location on Zhukyu Avenue. The 2 deeds were for the shophouse in the front and the courtyard right behind it. Chu Lian's eyes went wide with astonishment and she exclaimed, "Where did you get such a good storefront?" All the good locations on Zhukyu Street were already owned by someone high-ranking in the capital. It was no simple task to obtain such a good storefront, as it was something that money couldn't buy. Even if these were obtainable through wealth alone, the value of these 2 deeds added together would be at least 5,000 taels. That was going by a conservative estimate. Even House Jingan in its prime hadn't owned any storefronts on Zhukyu Street. At the most, they had held only 1 or 2 shops on a side street nearby. Chapter 571, Don't Seduce Me, 2, Do You Like It? He Changdi didn't answer Chu Lian's question. He just wanted to know whether she liked it or not. Chu Lian gaped a little. She didn't know what to say, her husband was just too mysterious. She answered honestly, who wouldn't like a great store like this? Although she implied that she liked it, her face didn't show much excitement at all. "I've already sent someone to the authorities to transfer this deed into your name. It's good as long as you like it. Don't you like cooking? You can do whatever you like with this shopfront." He Changdi's icy gaze softened when he looked at her. Chu Lian gripped the deeds tightly. She raised her head to look into her husband's fathomless eyes. "Hubby, tell me now. Where did you get the money for these?" She had asked this question back when he had bought jewelry for her, but he Changdi hadn't given her an answer. After obtaining this storefront for her, he must have already spent at least 10,000 taels altogether. All he had done recently was join the Northern Army. He had never done any business on the side, so how did he obtain so much money? Could it be through bribery? However, in her subconscious mind, Chu Lian didn't want him to have obtained his money through those means. Seeing her tightly knit brows, he Changdi knew that his wife's thoughts had veered away from legal means. A dry laugh came out of him, and he couldn't help but pinch her cheeks. "Liana, what is going through your head? It's not what you think it is." Chu Lian rolled her eyes at him. "Your way of earning money is just too profitable. Even my businesses don't bring in nearly as much as you." He Changdi knew that it wasn't good for him to keep Chu Lian in the dark. If he didn't explain himself to her, she would likely let her imagination run wild. Therefore, rather than letting her listen to wild rumors or gossip, he might as well tell it to her straight. He beckoned Chu Lian over with his long fingers. Chu Lian hesitated for a moment, but still chose to lean into his embrace, putting her ear close to his lips. He Sanlang's deep voice whispered something into her ears. A few moments later, Chu Lian sat up straight with her eyes wide open, staring at him in disbelief. She was completely flabbergasted. Is this true? He Sanlang smiled. Has your husband ever lied to you? You guys are really too brazen. He Changdi shook his head. Any noble would have done the exact same thing in this case. I've already held myself back. Chu Lian stopped asking about the origin of his money. She only warned He Changdi to handle the hot potato in his hands carefully. He Sanlang didn't want her to worry, so he quickly changed topics. Now that you have this storefront, what do you plan to do? Chu Lian knew his motivations very well in her heart. He Sanlang had probably heard of the matriarch taking back Guilin restaurant, so he had spent his money to make it up to her. Although his expressions were as cold and stiff as the king of hell and he disliked speaking, his actions spoke volumes. I'll open a restaurant. When she had lost Guilin restaurant, she had already been planning on opening another, but it wasn't easy to find a good location. Furthermore, she didn't have that much money on hand, as she had invested heavily in the market at the northern border. Thus, her plans had been delayed. With He Sanlang's present, she could put her plans into action earlier than she had expected. He Changdi raised one sharp brow. As he had expected, Chu Lian would open a restaurant again. The couple hadn't snuggled and chatted intimately like this for a long time, so He Sanlang, the man of few words, was in the mood to speak more. When he recalled how Chu Lian had set up Guilin restaurant by herself, He Changdi felt admiration towards his little woman. Just what was her brain made of? How could it produce so many wondrous thoughts? She even had ideas that he would never be able to think of. When he had been chatting with his sworn brother Prince Jin one day, even Prince Jin had spoken highly of Chu Lian's innovative ideas. Chapter 572, New Restaurant, 1. Is it going to be just like Guilin restaurant? He Changdi became curious as to what his wife had in mind. Back when Chu Lian had single-handedly brought Guilin restaurant to fame, he hadn't helped at all, but now, he wanted to be a pillar of support for her. Chu Lian shook her head. It'd be boring to do the same thing again. This time, I'll open a restaurant specializing in roast duck. I'm going to be selling the roast duck I made at Prince Weiss estate. You've already tried it, so what do you think? He Sanlang burst into a bout of open laughter. In that case, I'm going to be receiving complaints from fourth prince. Confused, Chu Lian tilted her head, but she immediately caught on. Prince Jin is the owner of Yuhong Restaurant. Wasn't Yuhong Restaurant famed for having the best roast duck in the capital? Royal Princess Duanjia had brought her there for a meal last year, but the taste of their duck was nothing to write home about. Isn't that even better? Prince Jin is rich anyways, and that Yuhong Restaurant only has a single signature dish. Besides, the restaurant I'm going to open won't just be selling roast duck. Feeling helpless, He Changdi said, this time, I'll find you some helpers, so don't push yourself to take care of everything. There were two downsides if Chu Lian personally managed the restaurant. Firstly, it'd be tough on her. Secondly, it wouldn't reflect well on her since she had given the broken Guilin restaurant away. If it was left to someone else to manage, even if people suspected them, they wouldn't go running their mouths off if they didn't have any solid evidence. This would also serve to protect the tentative peace between Chu Lian and Matriarch He on the surface. Chu Lian knew that He Changdi was doing this for her own good, so she didn't object. When the time came for it to open, she could just make a few covert trips there to keep an eye on things. Chu Lian nodded. He Sanlang reached out to pull Chu Lian into his embrace. Well, move out once father returns. Caught off guard by this sudden statement, Chu Lian's eyes went wide. She put her hand on his chest and asked, really? Her mind immediately rejected this possibility. Although Count Jingan had 3 sons, the eldest had just divorced and had no heirs. The second one was a stubborn man who still hadn't married. She and He Changdi may have gotten married last year, but they had only consummated their marriage recently. Other than that, there was only the elderly matriarch He and her mother-in-law, who had only just recovered. It wouldn't be reasonable for the third branch to move out at this point of time. Changdi kept his eyes on his wife's face. When he noticed that the joy from receiving the deeds paled in comparison to the news of them moving out, he became even more resolute with regards to this decision. Since his aunt and cousin had moved in, his grandmother had become increasingly paranoid. There was a saying amongst the common folk that some things were better with distance. It actually wasn't normal for a family of dual nobilities to live under one roof. Now that he had become a marquis, he could leave this house to his father once his father returned. He had his own ways to convince his father to let the two of them move out. Second brother couldn't remain single forever either, so father would make the decision for him. With mother's health improving day by day, there wasn't much left for him to worry about in House Jingan. After moving out with his wife, Chu Lian would then be the one to handle their estate, so he would no longer have to be stuck between his wife and his grandmother. Changdi stroked her hair. "I'm your husband. Have I ever lied to you?" Chu Lian's mood immediately brightened up. She didn't want to interfere with how Changdi was going to persuade his parents, so she would just wait to move out with him. The couple chatted for a while longer before going to have a meal together. Chapter 573, New Restaurant, 2. On the next day, the help that Changdi had arranged for Chu Lian arrived. Zhu Wen was one of Changdi's subordinates from the Northern Army. He was 18 years old this year and was now working under Changdi. He had come from a family of merchants and was quick on his feet, so he had been sent to aid Chu Lian with her restaurant. Zhu Wen respectfully greeted Chu Lian. Due to his years at the northern border, his face was tanned, and he was as skinny as a monkey. When he smiled, his wide grin and white teeth made him look rather dim. He didn't greet her as third young madam or Marchioness An Yuan. Instead, he addressed her as sister-in-law. A twitch developed in Chu Lian's forehead. This fellow looked too silly and sweet. Did Changdi make a mistake and send the most honest person he had? Chu Lian nodded and had him sit down to talk. "Since you've come to me, do you know what you're here to do?" Zhu Wen laughed in a foolish manner and rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment. "Brother, he told me to help you earn money, sister-in-law." Chu Lian couldn't help but chuckle. This fellow was way too honest. Could such a silly person actually manage the restaurant? "I heard from our brothers that sister-in-law's cooking is delicious. Could I have a taste of it today?" After saying that, he lowered his head bashfully. This fellow had the guts to ask for a free meal. Chu Lian had finally found a praiseworthy quality in him. "After I'm done with instructing you, you can stay for lunch. I'll have Lai Yu escort you to the guest's courtyard and you can have your lunch there." Chu Lian wasn't someone who would be so stingy as to not provide a meal. When she finally got down to business with this sweet and silly-looking Jew when over the restaurant, she was astonished to find that this man was nothing like he seemed. He was actually a smart man, someone who hid his abilities to gain the upper hand. Thanks to the influence of his family, he had been gaining experience with managing a shop ever since childhood, and he was even able to contribute his own ideas. If one wasn't careful and judged a book by its cover, they would be fooled by him. If she had to compare, Zhu Wen was certainly just as good as manager Qin. After lunch, Lai Yu sent the satisfied Zhu Wen out. Chu Lian wrote a letter to Royal Princess Duanjia to let her know that she was going to open another restaurant. When Royal Princess Duanjia heard that Chu Lian was going to have roast duck as the signature dish, she was so interested that she personally paid a visit to discuss and contribute ideas. Time flew by, and Changdi's long leave ended. Every day, he had to go to the Ministry of War to work, and he had to attend court every single morning. It was February, so the days were still shorter than the nights. Sanlang left home before the sun rose each day. For the past 2 days, Chu Lian insisted on waking up with him to have breakfast together. She would then send him off to the courtyard's entrance. However, because of that, she hadn't been sleeping well. After going to Qingxi Hall for morning greetings, she was always extremely sleepy when she returned. In just a few days, her sleep patterns had become a mess and her mind grew muddled. Changdi had been observing all this. Thus, one fine morning, when Chu Lian felt some movement next to her, she prepared to get up just as she had previously. However, in the next second, She was unexpectedly pressed down by He Sanlang. After a bout of morning exercise, Chu Lian didn't even have the strength to move her fingers, so she wasn't able to get up to have breakfast with her husband. Thanks to that, she no longer got up early, so her sleep patterns actually improved. He Sanlang did this for a few consecutive days. When they were done with their exercise, Chu Lian would be so sore all over that she couldn't even open her eyes. On the other hand, He Changdis' mood was better than ever. Chu Lian couldn't take it any longer, so she obediently slept in the morning and never mentioned getting up early again. It was only then that He Sanlang let her off the hook. Time quickly passed. On one particular day, Chu Lian was accompanying Countess Jinggan to Qingxi Hall to greet the matriarch. When matriarch He mentioned something out of the blue. This statement instantly left both Chu Lian and her mother-in-law flabbergasted. Still in shock, Countess Jinggan asked, "Mother, you want me to manage the estate?" Matriarch He sat on the raised platform in the center of the room, with Muxiang and Pan Yanzhen massaging her legs and shoulders. She seemed relaxed as she slowly opened her eyes to look at Madame Liu. "Now that you've mostly recovered, as the eldest daughter-in-law of the family, it makes perfect sense for you to take over the management of the household." Chapter 574. Countess Jinggan takes over. 1. What else could Countess Jinggan say? Matriarch He was using her responsibility as a daughter-in-law to pressure her. If she didn't take over the management of the household, then she would deemed unfilial. While standing beside them, Chu Lian frowned slightly. She didn't understand Matriarch He's intentions. Although she wanted to speak up for her mother-in-law, the matriarch and Madame Liu were both her elders. She was in no position to speak right now. Countess Jinggan was soft-hearted. She didn't dare to disobey the matriarch up front. Thus, she reluctantly agreed. She couldn't decline because she didn't have any legitimate reason to refuse. She hadn't managed the household in the past because she had been seriously ill and she didn't have the energy to do it. She had even needed the matriarch's help to take care of her. However, her health had gotten better now. Since the matriarch had personally requested to hand over the rights to manage the household to her, she didn't have any good reason to decline. Countess Jinggan grasped the handkerchief in her hand, stood up, and bobbed towards the matriarch. "Mother, please rest assured. I'll do my best to manage the household. Hurry and stand up. You've just recovered, so there's no need to keep bowing like that. Well then, I'll rest easy now that you'll be taking care of the household affairs. If you have any questions, feel free to ask Muxiang and Miss Ying." A smile finally appeared on the matriarch's face. "I understand." Thus, Countess Jinggan returned to her courtyard with several maidservants, each carrying a stack of account books. Chu Lian followed behind her mother-in-law. She noticed that the countess was frowning deeply, and she appeared to be laden with worry. She tried consoling Countess Jinggan. "Mother, you don't have to worry too much. We don't have that many people in our estate. There's only a head steward and an assisting steward in the outer court. There are also plenty of senior servants acting as stewards in the inner court. As long as you keep these people in check and you look over the account books thoroughly, there shouldn't be any major problems." Countess Jinggan was a little embarrassed. She smiled apologetically at Chu Lian. "I'm really useless. At this age, I still need reassurance from a young girl like you. Don't worry, I'm not that easily fooled. When I married into House Jinggan, I did manage the household for several years. It's good that mother thinks of it this way. If you need any help, you can send someone to Songtao Court to find me. I don't have much to do anyway. Although I've never managed a household before, I can help you out." Countess Jinggan felt more relaxed after Chu Lian's offer of help. She nodded and told her to return to her courtyard for some rest. She patted Chu Lian's hand. "All right, it's just some minor household affairs. I have senior servants who can assist me as well, so it'll be fine. You should concentrate on nourishing your body. I'm still waiting for my grandsons." Chu Lian's face immediately reddened due to her mother-in-law's words. She had never thought about having children at such a young age. Back then, she had even thought about finding a nice and quiet place to live out a rural lifestyle in seclusion. However, with the passage of time and the progression of her relationship with He Changdi, She was actually starting to hope that a child would form in her belly as soon as possible. She and He Changdi could watch their adorable little child grow up, bit by bit. They could raise him or her together. After sending Chu Lian off with her servants, Madame Liu returned to her own courtyard and headed directly for her study. She had much to do today, and she wasn't going to have any free time to take care of her granddaughters. She sat in front of her desk and flipped open the account books. It didn't take long before Countess Jingan discovered many suspicious gaps in them. She was dumbfounded after making a rough calculation of the estate's assets. Why were there so few stores and properties left in the public accounts? Judging by these calculations, the monthly income probably wouldn't even hit 500 taels. Moreover, that was under the assumption that the stores were turning a profit. Chapter 575. Countess Jingan takes over. 2. As for their farm holdings, they only collected rent from the tenants at the end of the year. The farms usually produced some fruits and vegetables, which were usually only sent to the estate for their own consumption. They wouldn't be able to make much money even if they sold the produce from that. The servants within the estate and their other properties, the shopkeepers and workers of the stores, as well as the monthly allowances of the masters of the estate. These were what their estate's income had to support. Their monthly expenses were approximately 600 to 700 taels. It was just a rough estimate that didn't include the cost of maintaining friendships with other noble estates. The monthly income of their estate was only 500 taels. Their expenses were so much more than the profit collected from their assets. She recalled the smirk on her sister-in-law's face when the matriarch had handed the management rights of the household to her. Countess Jingan was now boiling with rage. Yet, at the same time, she felt frustrated and helpless. She remembered clearly that House Jingan hadn't been in this shape 20 years ago. When she had been in charge of the shared accounts, the cash flow had been around 5,000 to 6,000 taels. They earned a lot of monthly profit from the stores, properties, and rural estates. After so many years, how had House Jingan ended up like this? They hadn't accumulated any savings and their finances had instead withered away into poverty. By the time the accounts had been handed to her, the estate was already struggling to make ends meet. Countess Jingan's most trusted servant, senior servant Wang, was beside her. She asked worriedly, "Madam, what's wrong?" Great Dr. Miao instructed this old servant that you can't stress yourself out since you've just gotten better. Countess Jingan sighed and handed the paper with her rough calculations to senior servant Wang. "Suxin, take a look yourself." Suxin was senior servant Wang's name when she had still been a maidservant. It was only Countess Jingan who still called her that. Senior servant Wang took the paper and swiftly glanced over it. She was astounded. "Madam, how can this be?" The senior servant had still been inwardly rejoicing for her madam since her health had gotten better. She thought that it was time for her madam to take control of the household affairs again. Countess Jingan was the wife of the head of House Jingan, so it was better that House Jingan's finances were in her control rather than in eldest madam's hands. However, who knew that she had just been thrown a bomb instead? The countess had ended up in the losing end of this deal. Countess Jingan was extremely worried. The management of the household was in her hands now. Thus, she would have to use her personal funds to support the entire estate starting tomorrow. Most of her dowry had been used up on her medication in the past. She didn't have the money to make up for the loss of the public accounts right now. As Countess Jingan's most trusted servant, senior servant Wang was the one who understood her the most. Looking at the expression on her face, she knew that Madam was trying to think of a way to make up the deficiency in fund. But how were they going to get that money? They would need at least 3,000 to 4,000 taels just to make the accounts even. She hesitated for a moment, before steeling herself and speaking with determination. "Madam, you can't just try to work this out by yourself. You must bring up this matter with the matriarch and eldest madam." Although Countess Jingan was somewhat timid and soft-hearted, that didn't mean that she was muddle-headed. After hearing senior servant Wang's reminder, she decided to look for eldest madam. She promptly went over to eldest madam's living quarters within Qingxi Hall with her servants. However, they were chased out by eldest madam in less than an hour. While Countess Jingan and her servants were walking back to their courtyard, senior servant Wang was huffing with rage. How could eldest madam act that way? This old servant refuses to believe that she had nothing to do with the deficits in the public account. He Ying hadn't been willing to contribute even 1 or 2 silver taels. Moreover, she had pushed all the blame onto Madame Zhu, who had already divorced with He Dalang. While Madame Zhu was likely the main reason for the deficits, it was impossible to think that He Ying wasn't part of the problem either. Countess Jingan shook her head. All right, don't say any more. People are going to gossip if this spreads. Chapter 576. My dear daughter. 1. Senior servant Wang was extremely anxious. But, madam, I'm fine. I'll think of a solution for this problem. Senior servant Wang had no choice but to keep quiet then. Over the next few days, Chu Lian felt that there was something strange going on with Countess Jingan's courtyard whenever she went over for morning greetings. However, Chu Lian couldn't pinpoint what exactly was amiss. Chu Lian was currently sketching jewelry designs for Treasure Pavilion in her little study with a piece of charcoal. When she abruptly came to a halt in the middle of her sketch, Xian quickly noticed her movements. The handmaid set down the needle and thread within her hands and asked, "Third young madam, what's wrong?" Chu Lian put down the thin charcoal block in her hand and sighed. "I've finally realized why I felt that there was something strange about Mother's courtyard recently." Xian stared at her with wide eyes, waiting for her to continue. "Did you notice that many of the decorations inside Mother's room have been changed?" Xian furrowed her brows upon this realization after Chu Lian's reminder. There used to be a pair of flower-patterned cloisonné vases on the table next to the main seats of the parlor. Several gorgeous peacock feathers had been on display inside the vases. They had even talked about those pair of cloisonné vases before during one of their chats. Those were some very rare vases. Senior servant Gui had even mentioned that they might have been handed down from a previous dynasty and were probably worth several thousands of taels. Wenqing and Wenlan had been stunned after hearing that. They had never seen such a valuable vase before. Countess Jingan had had a very rich dowry. She had come from a large clan in Jiangnan, which had existed for several hundred years. They had also been quite famous during the previous dynasty. However, their family had been on a slow decline since the era of Emperor Chengping. Even so, they hadn't been stringy with Countess Jingan when she had gotten married. At that time, Countess Jingan's dowry was considered one of the most valuable amongst the noble madams within the capital. It was a pity that she had been in poor health ever since the birth of her third son. After over a decade of seeking treatments and taking expensive medications, her dowry was nearly spent. However, a starving camel was still bigger than a horse. Countess Jingan still had several treasures stowed away at her place. The pair of red jade bangles that she had previously given to Chu Lian and Madame Zhu was one of them. Those cloison vases were also another one of her hidden treasures. "The vases have been changed," Xian responded with shock. Chu Lian nodded. Actually, it wasn't just those vases that had been changed. Several other decorations in the room had also been replaced. While the replacements weren't considered too bad, but their quality was inferior compared to the previous decorations. If she hadn't been drawing designs today and thinking about the patterns on the artworks she had seen during modern times, she wouldn't have thought about those vases. But, weren't those vases Madame's most treasured items? Xian asked in confusion. Senior servant Wang had once said that that pair of cloisonné vases had been placed in the parlor for nearly 30 years. They had allegedly been placed in there on the second day of Count Jingan and Countess Jingan's marriage. Countess Jingan treated them like precious treasures and often dusted them off herself. Since she cherished and loved them so much, why would she replace them now? Chu Lian couldn't think of a reason at the moment. She ordered Xian, "Find out what's happened in Mother's courtyard recently." Xian acknowledged the order and left immediately. Chu Lian actually had a good guess in her heart, but she couldn't be certain. She shook her head and decided to wait for Xian's information. If her speculation turned out to be true, then, as juniors, she and He Changdi couldn't stand by and ignore this matter. Recently, her mother-in-law had been appearing much more haggard than before. Even great Dr. Miao had specially visited her, asking her to urge Countess Jingan to pay more attention to her health. She shouldn't let his medical skills and the valuable medicines go to waste by relapsing back into illness. Chapter 577, My Dear Daughter, 2. Xian didn't return until the evening. She secretly reported the information that she learnt to Chu Lian. Chu Lian listened to her report and confirmed her suspicions. One of the cloisonné vases had been pawned away. Although Countess Jingan had done it stealthily, it was impossible to do it without any traces. Chu Lian guessed that the money received from pawning the vase had probably been deposited into House Jingan's public accounts. As Chu Lian waited for He Changdi to return for dinner, she thought about how she should tell him about this issue. Unfortunately, Lai Yu came to report that He Sanlang was going to have dinner with his colleagues from the Ministry of War tonight. Eldest brother He Changqi and second brother He Changjue would also be present at the dinner, so it seemed like he would be coming back slightly later tonight. Chu Lian sent Lai Yu back with an acknowledgement. She promptly asked senior servant Gui to set up the meal so she could finish eating earlier and go to bed afterwards. At the same time that Chu Lian received the report, Matriarch He was also notified. The matriarch ordered the manservants of the outer court to take good care of her grandsons, who were returning late at night. After dinner, He Ying pulled her daughter into her bedroom and whispered into her ears. Pan Nyanzan's face instantly flushed. She nervously tightened her grasp on the handkerchief in her hand and asked timidly, "Mother, is this really all right?" He Ying slapped her daughter's back. "What's wrong with it? If we don't use this method, you'll never be able to stay in the Jingan estate. Do you really want to marry those poor, powerless, and pathetic men? Do you want to serve under their strict mothers?" Pan Yanzhan hastily shook her head. "No. I don't." "Then do as I've taught you. If it doesn't work out, I have my own way of making sure that no one finds out. If it's successful, even your grandmother won't be able to stop you from marrying into House Jingan." Pan Yanzhan summoned all her courage, bit her lips, and finally gave her mother a nod. "All right, mother, I'll listen to everything you say." "That's right. That's my good daughter." All those years of guidance weren't in vain. The same night, around 11 p.m., the three brothers of the He family returned to the estate together. It was already too late at night, so He Erlang didn't return to the left military guards. He joined his two brothers in their carriage and returned to the estate. Once the three brothers entered the estate, the assistant steward and a group of manservants promptly greeted them. The three brothers weren't the only ones who had drunk a lot tonight. Their personal manservants had also been forced to drink in a separate room. Their personal manservants, Lai Yu and Kangshou, had already been taken to a nearby room in the outer court to rest. The assistant steward didn't dare to be remiss in his care because of Matriarch He's earlier instructions. Amongst the three brothers, only He Changdi remained slightly more sober. If it weren't for him, they probably wouldn't have been able to return and would have stayed outside overnight. The restaurant they had dinner at was right across the street from Wangxian Chamber, the most famous brothel within the capital. He Changdi's personality was such that he didn't like drinking alcohol. He only had a moderate alcohol tolerance, so even if he controlled how much he drank, he still had a headache right now. The eldest brother, He Changqi, was the most drunk. Erlang was still able to speak, but he was clearly in the middle of a drunk high based on how he talked. He Changdi massaged his temples with one hand. His brows furrowed as he gave orders to the steward in a low voice, "Just take eldest brother and second brother over to the main study in the outer court to rest. It's late, so make sure you don't disturb grandmother and mother." A burly manservant carried He Changqi on his back, straight to a room inside the study to rest. However, He Changjue started acting up in his drunken state. He refused to go into the room to rest. Moreover, he even held on to He Changdi, refusing to let him leave. "Hey, third brother, don't leave. Let's drink some more. It's been so long since we've had a good drink together." Chapter 578, Mishap 1. He Changdi let out a cold snort. He mercilessly rejected his brother, second brother. "If you want to keep drinking, you can do it by yourself. I'm tired, I'm heading back to my place to rest." However, He Chungjue was a stubborn one. He continued hanging on to He Chengdi's arm. Is it just because third sister-in-law might be waiting up for you? Don't worry. It's already this late. I'm sure she's already gone to bed. He Chengdi chuckled coldly. Someone who's still single won't understand. He Sanlang's words stirred up the hornet's nest. He Chungjue still had enough consciousness left to recognize the insult. Furthermore, his path to love had never been smooth. His brother's mocking tipped him over the edge and he leaped up to attack He Chengdi. Of course, He Chengdi was no pushover. They started brawling noisily right there in the study. Perhaps due to their drunkenness, the brothers fought fiercely. The maidservant waiting outside was pale with fright. She hurriedly ran off to find the steward. The steward was already old, so there was no way he could pull apart his two masters. In the end, he ordered some servants to bring the family soldiers here to stop their fight. You little brat. Don't you dare show off with your wife in front of me in the future, or I'll knock all your teeth out. He Erlang was still scolding his little brother when they were pulled apart, the very picture of a drunk maniac. He Chengdi had suffered a punch of the corner of his lips, which was starting to bruise. However, at least he had left Erlang in much worse shape. He shifted his jaw and muttered idiot under his breath. Just as he was about to return to the inner court to look for his wife, the steward stopped him. Ah, second young master, third young master, please, drink a bowl of sobering soup before you head back to rest. There was a maidservant standing behind the assistant steward with a food container in hand. When the steward finished speaking, the maidservant hurried forward and set down the box on the table. She brought out 2 warm bowls of sobering soup and offered one each to He Chungjue and He Chengdi. After that brief bout, both brothers were a little thirsty. He Chungjue took the bowl and downed it in one gulp. He even had another 2 cups of tea in addition. He Chengdi took up the porcelain bowl. When he put it to his mouth, he frowned. The smell of this sobering soup was strange. He didn't like drinking these types of medicinal soups, so he only had less than half the bowl. When he returned to the estate, he had already sent someone to Songtao Court to ask about his wife. The person he sent returned to say that third young madam had already gone to bed. He Sanlang escorted his brother to the side room in the study and waited until the servants had helped him out of his clothes and laid him in bed. The assistant steward drew closer with a smile. Third young master, would you like to rest here in the outer court, or return to the inner court tonight? Since Chu Lian was already asleep, He Chengdi told the steward to arrange a side room for him in the outer court as well. The assistant steward personally led He Sanlang to the side room on the left of the main study. After he entered the room, He Chengdi came out again in a few minutes. He told the manservant guarding the door outside, prepare the room next to second brother. I'll sleep over there. The manservant quickly ran off to follow his orders. While He Erlang was a good drinker, he became unreliable once he was high. He Sanlang was worried that something would happen to him in the night, so he decided to watch over his brother instead. By the time he finally laid down to rest, it was already an hour later. Ever since he had gotten married, He Chengdi hadn't spent many nights in the main study in the outer court. He had also slept in this particular side room a few times before. However, for some reason, it felt uncomfortable this time. The blankets didn't feel as soft, the bedding wasn't comfortable enough, his sides were empty, making him feel that the entire room was too empty and quiet. Chapter 579, Mishap, 2. He Chengdi forced himself to sleep. When he turned to his side, he reached out for the warm body that was usually beside him. The emptiness that met his arm startled He Chengdi awake. He stared at the bed curtains for a few seconds before realizing that this wasn't his bedroom in Songtao Court and that Chu Lian wasn't by his side right now. An irritable heat was building up within him. He tossed and turned, but he couldn't sleep. His mind was full of Chu Lian. Finally, he ended up flipping the blankets aside and getting off the bed. The night was quiet. Even the manservant who was supposed to be on duty through the night was sound asleep in the side room. He Chengdi walked over to the window and opened it. He somersaulted out easily and rushed straight for Songtao Court. The moment he entered Songtao Court through the window, he was stopped by a soft voice. Who's there? Wenqing dashed over, only to see He Changdi sitting on the windowsill, in the middle of breaking into his own room. The corner of her mouth twitched uncontrollably and she set down her raised sword. She greeted him with a bob, "Third young master." He Changdi dismissed her with a wave of his hand and finished entering the bedroom, closing the window on the way. Chu Lian was in the middle of some sweet dreams when something caught her and tightened around her. She turned around and faced He Changdi, trying to push the thing holding onto her away. "Liana, it's me." He Changdi's eyes were like black holes in the darkness, as bottomless and impenetrable as a deep lake. Unfortunately, Chu Lian was still sleeping, so she couldn't see that his eyes were hazy with desire. He Changdi traced the profile of Chu Lian's face with his fingers, but it only made the heat within him worse. He buried his head into the crook of her shoulder and called her name, Liana. Chu Lian usually slept like a log, and this night was no exception. When she was trapped in his tight embrace, all she did was struggle perfunctorily twice. The moment she found that her struggles were useless, she gave up and let He Changdi do as he wanted. Perhaps due to the familiar scent around her, she relaxed more and even reached out to hug He Changdi's narrow waist. The fire burning in He Sanlang's heart was becoming unbearable. He kissed the sensitive back of Chu Lian's ear, huffing out his breath over her soft, little earlobe. His pants were starting to become heavier. His hands roamed freely over Chu Lian's body until she finally awoke. When she first opened her eyes, a sleepy haze still covered them. It was when her top was suddenly taken away that she immediately came to her senses. He Sanlang could tell that she had woken up, so he covered her lips with his own and started plundering with his tongue. Chu Lian made some muffled sounds, intending to protest, but she soon realized that He Changdi was especially forceful tonight. He wouldn't let her retreat at all. She was soon teased to the point of wanting. When He Sanlang finally entered her, forcefully and mercilessly, Chu Lian felt like her waist was about to break. However, no matter how much she pleaded, it was no use. An hour later, the bedroom finally quietened down again. Wenqing had remained on duty in the side room at first, but later on, she had quietly slipped away. Chu Lian was extremely put out. Her throat was hoarse from her cries and she didn't even know what day it was. It wasn't until He Changdi carried her into the bathtub that she regained her senses. He Sanlang used a soft cloth to clean his wife's body. Chu Lian was sprawled against his chest without even the strength to move a single finger. She suddenly bit harshly on He Changdi's shoulder, leaving 2 neat rows of teeth marks on the muscles there. She complained with her hoarse voice, "He Changdi, you're actually a huge pervert, aren't you?" He Sanlang didn't mind whatever his wife called him. He chuckled lowly and whispered teasingly into her ear, "Haven't I serviced you enough? I thought all your energy should have been used up by now." Chapter 580, Mishap, 3. Chu Lian immediately shut up and buried her head into his chest after she heard that. He Changdi stroked her back soothingly. His palm slid down to her waist and massaged it gently. They soaked in the tub together for a calm moment until Chu Lian felt the aches in her body easing. She looked up at He Changdi with her cheek still on his chest. "Where did you go to drink tonight? Why did you come back so late? Are eldest brother and second brother resting in the outer court?" He Changdi leaned against the tub with one arm around Chu Lian. His other arm was still massaging her slender willowy waist. He shut his eyes as he replied in his husky, magnetic voice, "Muai restaurant. Eldest brother and second brother drank even more than I did. They were already resting when I left the outer court." Chu Lian's eyes widened in surprise. Muai restaurant. Since He Sanlang had given her that storefront on Jukyu Avenue, she had specially gone to Juwen for more details on the area. If she remembered correctly, Muai restaurant was right opposite the most famous brothel in the capital. Chu Lian stared at He Changdi's handsome face while biting her lip. He Sanlang's eyes slid open a tiny bit. He peeked at Chu Lian before shutting them again in a suspiciously calm manner. "If I did anything outside, would you have begged for mercy like that just now?" He Changdi drew closer and whispered the rest right into Chu Lian's sensitive ear. "Your voice even turned hoarse from all your screaming." Chu Lian's face exploded into a furious blush. She stared with wide almond-shaped eyes. She hadn't thought that Sanlang would be able to act so lewd. Hadn't he always been the restrained, gentlemanly type? Why are your eyes opened so wide? Did I say something wrong? Sanlang was getting into it. Chu Lian didn't want to acknowledge his sudden lunatic fit. Her husband had never been normal anyway. After a short moment, Chu Lian felt that there was something wrong. She looked up and asked, "Wait, didn't you return around 11 p.m.? Why did you come over to Songtao Court so late? I sent someone to check when I came back, and the servants said that you were already sleeping, so I was planning to rest in the main study with my brothers." Thoughts flew around in Chu Lian's head. So her husband hadn't been able to fall asleep in the outer court and had come back secretly in the middle of the night. However, he had been brimming with desire when he had returned. The way he had acted, all forceful and ferocious, was very different from how he normally acted as well. Over the past few days, whenever they had battled it out in the bedroom, he would keep her feelings in mind even if he wanted more. Chu Lian hadn't replied for some time, so Sanlang opened his eyes. He let out a simple, to prompt her. His wife seemed to be thinking of how to phrase her words. She eventually asked, "Did you feel any discomfort when you came back?" Sanlang frowned as he thought. Chu Lian continued speaking before he could reply, "I slept late last night because there was something I wanted to discuss with you. I was looking at the account books in my study and I only slept when it was past 11. It all became clear to Changdi after Chu Lian's explanation. Someone must have tried to trick him last night. His wife hadn't gone to sleep yet, but the senior servant he had sent to check on her had told him that his wife was already asleep. This must have been arranged in advance by someone. As for why they would do so, it was obvious that they wanted him to sleep in the outer court. Ever since he had returned from the northern border, he had added some of his soldiers to the guard at the Jingan estate. Coupled with the existing family soldiers, the estate had become like a steel bucket. Even flies wouldn't be able to enter. Since strangers wouldn't be able to enter the estate, then it could only have been someone from the inside. Chapter 581, Mishap, 4. This story is completely free to read on Volaranovels. Please support my translations on the original source. Changdi's eyes narrowed. When he recalled that his two older brothers were still sleeping in the outer court, he lifted Chu Lian up from the bathtub and covered her snugly with his large sleep shirt. He carried her over to the bed and set her down. Sanlang petted her smooth hair. "Liana, you should sleep first. I'm going to take a look at the outer court." He quickly changed into a fresh set of clothes. As he was about to leave, he found that Chu Lian had also changed into a normal dress. She tugged at his sleeve. "I'm going with you." Changdi hesitated for a moment before taking her hand. As they passed the changing screen, he swiped up a brocade cloak with a fox fur hood and put it on Chu Lian. The couple took some servants with them as they rushed over to the main study. Right as they left the inner court, the family soldiers who were on night duty came over to meet them. It was Huang Zhijian who was on duty tonight. He and the four young guards behind him bowed in greeting towards Changdi and Chu Lian. "Third young master, is anything the matter?" Sanlang cast an indifferent glance over Huang Zhijian. "We're going to the main study in the outer court." Huang Zhijian didn't question him and quietly followed behind the two masters with the other guards. From the outside, the main study was shrouded in darkness. Only a single row of dim lanterns lit up the corridors. Huang Zhijian could sense that something was wrong. There should have been at least a few manservants on guard outside the main study at this time of night, yet there were none. Even if there wasn't anyone using the main study, there would be 2 or 3 manservants on duty inside. They would rest in the side rooms of the study at night and keep watch over the valuable books and items within the study. There were 2 of their masters sleeping in the study right now, but there wasn't a single servant outside. Changdi paused for a moment in the corridor outside the main study. He was about to push open the doors to enter, but he realized that the doors had been locked from the inside. He immediately kicked the doors open and took Chu Lian with him as they strode into the section on the left. There were 2 smaller rooms here, with entrances facing each other. Changdi had been sleeping in the west one at first, while Erlang was sleeping in the one to the east. When they entered the east room and realized that there was no one inside, They checked the west room and found that Erlang was sleeping soundly within. His clothes were still the same as before, so He Changdi relaxed. Following that, He Changdi and Chu Lian headed over to the section on the right of the study. When he tried to open the door, he found that the room had been locked from the inside. He Changdi's first reaction was to kick in the doors again. A twitch developed in Chu Lian's eyes as she watched her husband's violent actions. However, it was when they walked up to the bedchamber and shoved the curtains open that they sucked in gasps of surprise. The bed was a chaotic mess. Various items of clothing were strewn all over and there was the distinctive smell of sex in the air. Although the room wasn't lit, one of the guards behind them lifted his lantern, casting light upon the situation inside. The two naked bodies lying on the bed were He Dalang and Pan Nianzhen. Everything had happened so abruptly that Pan Nianzhen only started to awaken after He Changdi kicked down the doors. Her head was aching so much it felt like it was being pierced by 1,000 silver needles. When she opened her eyes to see He Changdi fully dressed beside the bed, with icy cold eyes directed towards her, her body immediately froze up. The expression on her face slowly collapsed into despair. Chu Lian hated the way Pan Nianzhen was looking at He Changdi, so she stepped forward to block her husband from her gaze. The moment Pan Nianzhen caught sight of Chu Lian, she finally lost control of her emotions and let out a high-pitched wail. Following Pan Nianzhen's scream, the lights of lanterns flared to life all over the previously dark Jing'an estate. It was going to be a sleepless night for House Jing'an. Chapter 582, The Matriarch's Idea. 1. Chu Lian had never seen such a thick-skinned and shameless person in her life. The lantern lights were burning bright in Qingxi Hall, making as bright as day. Everyone in the family was gathered in the parlor of Qingxi Hall. The expressions on their faces were all grave and serious. Chu Lian sat next to He Changdi, her gaze focused on their eldest brother, He Changqi, who was seated on the main raised platform in the parlor. He Changqi still looked out of it. It was clear he hadn't recovered from the shock earlier. Although his figure was as large and burly as before, he seemed more like a lone and lost bear right now. The layer of stubble on his chin added to his fragile appearance. The grating sound of eldest Madam He Ying's sobs was ringing in everyone's ears now. Ever since she had discovered what had happened to He Dalang and Miss Pan, He Ying had been wailing her complaints in the parlor. She was acting like a crazy woman, unbefitting of a noble, causing everyone in the estate to look down on her even more. Matriarch He had been awakened in the middle of the night, so her expression wasn't looking too good. When she heard that something had happened to her granddaughter, she almost fainted right over. Following that, her ears had been filled with the incessant cries of He Ying, turning her Qingxi Hall into a noisy vegetable market. Even the servants couldn't bear to look. Countess Jing'an was helped into the parlor by senior servant Wang. Her face was as pale as a sheet, alarming Chu Lian, who hurriedly went up to support her other side. When Matriarch He saw that Countess Jing'an had arrived, she finally had someone to vent all the fire in her belly on. She slapped the table and roared furiously, "Look at the son you've birthed. That monster ruined his very own cousin." Countess Jing'an almost collapsed to the floor thanks to the matriarch's words. Luckily, there were two people supporting her on either side, or she might have fainted out of anger. The normally mild-mannered countess pointed at He Dalang with a trembling finger. Her voice was hoarse with pain as she ordered, "You unfilial son, kneel down right now." He Dalang's eyes were still empty. Upon hearing his mother's order, he didn't give out any sound of protest. He simply knelt down in the center of the parlor. His originally straight back was bent over, causing a pang of heartache in those who cared for him. Chu Lian shot a look at senior servant Wang, and they worked in unison to help Countess Jing'an over to a nearby chair. He Ying kneeled down on the ground and grabbed onto the matriarch's legs. She wailed, "Mother, you have to do something for Miss Zhen. My poor, innocent daughter. I was still looking for a good marriage for her." Pan Nianzhen had been taken back to Qingxi Hall by now. She was resting in one of the side rooms near the parlor, with senior servant Liu and a few maidservants taking care of her. She hadn't stopped crying ever since she had returned to Qingxi Hall, no matter how senior servant Liu and the maidservants tried to comfort her. Her eyes were already swollen to the size of walnuts. It was clear that she was feeling regret over her actions. Doubts arose in senior servant Liu's heart upon seeing Pan Nyanzan's performance. She kept a watchful eye on the maidservants by Pan Nyanzan's side. Over in the parlor, He Ying's plea for help had only darkened the storm on Matriarch He's face. Although she still felt guilt over her treatment of her daughter, the current situation was like a slap in her face. Thus, she finally spoke harshly towards her daughter. Even so, why didn't you take proper care of Miss Jun? Why would she be in the outer court at such a late hour? The matriarch still had her moments of clear wit. She could see that something was wrong with the situation. Even though this dynasty was more open-minded, there was an unspoken curfew at night for the ladies. Once the skies turned dark and they finished their dinners, noble ladies would stay in their own rooms. They wouldn't leave their own courtyards, let alone the estate. Last night, the three He brothers had returned at a very late hour. Why had Pan Nianzhan appeared in the main study of the outer court at that time? The answer to this question would determine whether He Dalang was a victim or a culprit. Chapter 583, The Matriarch's Idea, 2. He Ying had an instant of panic when she heard that question, but she quickly calmed down. As for why her daughter had appeared in the outer court, it was her doing of course. However, she had arranged for He Erlang to be the one. She had no idea why it had suddenly turned into He Dalang. However, since her mother was casting her suspicions on her now, she couldn't admit to that. In order to finish up her plans, she had no choice but to use He Dalang now. He Changqi was the eldest grandson of House Jingan. He was going to inherit the countship in the future. If she was really able to marry Miss Jun to him, it wouldn't be that bad of a choice compared to her original plans. He Ying's target shifted in the span of a few seconds of thinking. Anyway, things had already happened. She just had to push Miss Jun onto He Dalang no matter what. He Ying refused to speak. She only continued crying in sobs, annoying the matriarch even further. The problem at hand was tricky. The victim here was her granddaughter, who had only been living in the estate for a few months. However, in that short amount of time, that lovely flower had been plucked. Pan Nianzhan didn't have much status to begin with. Now that her body had been ruined, who could she marry? Even if they managed to get her married, she would only be a disgrace to House Jingan. Matriarch He bowed her head. She caught sight of her eldest grandson from the corner of her eyes. He didn't have any heirs and he had just divorced. Even though he was nearing 30, his previous wife had only left him 2 daughters. Miss Jun was Dalang's cousin and he had interacted with her a few times before. Dalang was meant to inherit the title of Count Jingan, so he couldn't stay single forever. He had to have an heir someday. Compared to bringing in an arrogant young noble miss from the outside, why not simply give Miss Jun to him in marriage? Miss Jun was still young, so surely she would be able to give him her heir. Eldest madam's non-stop crying had made everyone fidgety. Chu Lian looked at He Changdi. He Sanlang took in the ring of spectators in the parlor with his cold eyes and understood that he was the only one who could do something now. His eldest brother was still lost and blank. He hadn't recovered from his shock at all. His second brother was still sound asleep. His mother was too soft and she wasn't good at sticking her head out in these kinds of matters. Chu Lian did have that capability, but she was the youngest here and it wouldn't be easy for her to stand out. He Changdi couldn't bear to have his wife stand out again to face the crowd anyway. Aunt, stop crying. I'll send someone to investigate the details of this matter. If it's eldest brother's fault, he'll definitely take responsibility as a man. However, if I find out that this was all part of some unsavory plot, then don't blame me for not giving face to relative. He Changdi's voice was as icy as the tundra. He Ying couldn't help but twitch. She shot a quick, fearful glance at He Changdi, guilt rising in her heart. Matriarch He's face had lost all color. In this short amount of time, it seemed like her hair had turned more white and the wrinkles on her face had deepened. Since her youngest grandson had volunteered to take on the matter, she nodded in agreement. As much as she wanted to oversee the resolution of this, she didn't have the energy any longer. Matriarch He waved her hand weakly to dismiss them all. She spoke with some difficulty, her age clearly catching up, then I'll leave this matter to Sanlang. The sun hasn't risen yet. Return to your beds and get some rest. There's no need to come here for morning greetings tomorrow. After she was done speaking, matriarch He hobbled towards her bedroom with the help of Muxiang and another handmaid. He Ying tried to follow behind her, but she was stopped by the maidservant guarding the door. Apology showed on the maidservant's face. Eldest madam, the matriarch isn't feeling well. Please allow her to have some rest. He Ying wanted to barge in regardless, but senior servant Liu arrived just in time to persuade her otherwise. Chapter 584, Another Plot, 1. Within a side room in Qingxi Hall, Muk Saying was seated next to a desk. A single candle was lit, its flickering flame causing the shadows on Muxiang's face to ebb and flow. Someone knocked on the door at this time, to which Muxiang answered, "Enter." A maidservant pushed the door open and came into the room. She turned to lock the door before quickly moving to Muxiang. Muxiang was seated with her back to the light, dressed in a pretty azure dress embroidered with butterflies, very different from what most maidservants wore. She glanced over at the maidservant, who startled and hurriedly lowered her head, standing to attention. "How is it?" Replying to Miss Muxiang, "This servant has already gone out to investigate. Everything happened as we predicted, except for one thing. When second young master drank that sobering soup, there were no changes in him." Muxiang let out a peal of laughter. "How lucky for him." After a slight pause, she asked, "How did Pan Yanjun enter eldest young master's room?" The maidservant replied in detail. After she drank that medicine, she headed straight for third young master's room. However, third young master had already left, so she entered second young master's room instead. When third young master went to the inner court, second young master took third young master's room, leaving her with no choice but to go to eldest young master's room instead. He Daling had drunk too much that night. His days hadn't been going smoothly either. In his drunkenness, he had mistaken Pan Yanjun for Madame Zhu. In order to bolster her courage, Pan Yanjun had also taken an aphrodisiac. By the time she reached He Changqi's bedside, her mind had already turned fuzzy, so she didn't even notice that the man she was with wasn't He Changdi. Through this series of mishaps, the two of them had slept together. Of course, Muxiang had her own part to play in causing this mess. Pan Yanjun had not wanted to take the drug at first. However, her maidservant Pinglu had persuaded her otherwise and she had taken the aphrodisiac. Otherwise, if Pan Yanjun had been clear-minded, none of this would have happened. A mocking curve appeared on Muxiang's lips. Even a country bumpkin like Pan Yanjun wanted to have He Changdi. She had been practically asking for it. This was just a small lesson for her. If there were ever a next time, it would definitely be her last. When the maidservant realized that the air around Muxiang had changed, she trembled in fear and bowed her head even lower. She didn't dare to speak. "Continue working hard for me. Remember, your mother and younger brother are in my hands. If you're not obedient, I'll immediately have my men send their heads straight to your doorstep." Muxiang didn't have any particular expression on her face as she threatened the maidservant. The maidservant fell down to her knees in fright and kowtowed repeatedly. "Miss Muxiang, please spare this servant's mother and brother. This servant will definitely work hard for you." Muxiang snorted. "Rest assured. As long as you're good for me, your mother and brother will have happy and carefree lives." Once the shivering maidservant had left, Muxiang stayed seated at the desk for a long moment. The emotions in her impenetrable eyes changed as quickly as the candle's flame flickered. It wasn't until the first tendrils of dawn crept over the horizon that she picked up the brush on the table and quickly wrote something on a piece of paper. She wrote out a full 3 pages before she stopped. Then, she blew on the papers to dry the ink, carefully folded them, and finally put them into an envelope, which she tucked into her clothes. Muxiang stood up and walked over to the window, the determination to win flashing in her eyes. Since the heavens had given her a second chance, she wasn't going to squander it. This time, she wouldn't make the wrong choice. He Changdi was going to be her husband in this lifetime, just as he had in the previous one. As for that imposter in her body, She was definitely going to unmask her one day and have He Changdi see her for who she really was. Did that imposter really think that she had turned into House Ying's sixth Miss Chu Lian just because she was wearing her face? Dream on. She was the only one who could be Chu Lian. The pearl hidden in the dust was her alone. Chapter 585, Another Plot, 2. He Changdi sent Chu Lian back to Songtao Court before heading to the outer court. He gathered everyone in the main study in the outer court to question them personally. Actually, He Ying had left many traces behind, so it didn't take He Changdi much work to find out the truth. However, once he examined all the details again, he found that something was amiss. If they went by normal logic, He Ying would have surely targeted second brother. Why was it eldest brother who had gotten attacked in the end? It felt as if there was someone pulling the strings in the background, but he didn't have a shred of evidence nor any leads. There shouldn't be anyone else except for He Ying and her daughter who would do such a thing in the entire Jinggan estate. Finally, He Changdi discovered that there was something wrong with the sobering soup from that night. No wonder he had felt strange halfway into the night. He had only taken less than half of the soup, barely a few mouthfuls, yet his body had reacted. However, He Erlang had woken up the next day like nothing had happened to him at all. He had even been brimming with vigor. After a few questions to draw the truth out of his brother, He Sanlang didn't know how to react. It turned out that He Changjue had puked out everything he had drunk shortly after returning to the room. That was how he had been able to fall into a dead slumber. When he woke up in the middle of the night, he had gone to look for He Sanlang and ended up sleeping in his room instead. He Erlang's luck was crazily good. Chu Lian had the same thoughts when He Sanlang explained the events to her. When He Changjue woke up in the morning and found out what had happened over the night, he was extremely dissatisfied with He Ying and her daughter. He blamed the matriarch as well, for not reigning in his aunt and cousin. He never liked staying in the estate in the first place. Coupled with the mess the estate was in right now, he returned to the barracks that very afternoon. He Changdi changed into his official robes and attended court as usual in the morning. However, he didn't go to the Ministry of War later on. He headed straight back to the estate. He managed to catch Chu Lian just in time to have lunch with her. When they were done with lunch, the couple settled down for an afternoon nap. After the uproar in the night, they hadn't slept at all when they returned to Songtao Court. They had stayed awake until now. After filling their bellies, it was finally time to take a good rest. It was now the end of February, and the weather was slowly warming up. These few days, the estate had doused the fires for the internal heating. The couple leaned against the headboard of their bed together. Since they had just had their midday meal, they had to rest for a bit before sleeping. Chu Lian turned to He Changdi to ask, "Have you reported what you found to grandmother?" He Changdi had his eyes shut as he leaned against the headboard. He let out a grunt of affirmation. Chu Lian drew closer. "What did grandmother say?" He Changdi opened his eyes and looked at his wife. His tone held a little bit of helplessness as he replied, "Grandmother wants eldest brother to marry Pan Nianzhen and take her as his second wife." What? Chu Lian's eyes widened. How could grandmother think of that? Hadn't the matriarch grown too muddlehead? Although eldest brother and Madame Zhu had already divorced, he was still the eldest son of House Jinggan. He was meant to inherit the title one day. Even if he had to remarry, it shouldn't be this hurried. Even if he didn't marry another noble lady, eldest brother could at least choose a generous, kind-hearted lady of good standing. If not for eldest brother, they had to consider Miss An and Miss Lin as well. How could someone like Pan Nianzhen make a good stepmother for the two girls? If He Daling really married her, the first ones to suffer would be the children. He Changdi's brows were also locked together in a frown. Grandmother was too stubborn and biased at times. He Ying and Pan Nianzhen had made full use of grandmother's weakness. What does eldest brother think? He Daling had always been caring towards Chu Lian as an older brother. Furthermore, he had a big heart and was very considerate. He was a good brother. He Daling had suffered so much until he had finally gotten away from Madame Zhu. She didn't want He Daling to get out of the frying pan only to fall back into the fire. Chapter 586. Becoming the Countess is good too. 1. He Changdi sighed and shook his head. Eldest brother had a very honest personality, and he was very filial. It didn't matter whether this situation had been planned by aunt and her daughter or not. What's done was done, there was no way around it. If grandmother insisted on him marrying Pan Yenjin, he probably wouldn't reject. Even if it was clear that no happiness would come out of their marriage, he wouldn't reject it. It seemed like He Changchi had already given up and was only trying to please others. This course of action was extremely damaging to him. Can't you persuade eldest brother? Chu Lian suggested. He Changdi shook his head again. As the three brothers had grown up together, He Changdi knew his eldest brother very well despite their age gap of 10 years. As the eldest son of the family, He Changdi had been indoctrinated at a young age to become a pillar for the family and to take care of his brothers. He had an upright and responsible personality. He had to assume filial duties on behalf of his brothers as the eldest. In the Great Wu dynasty, filial piety was a core value of the country, so in normal situations, most children would never go against the wishes and decisions of their parents. Therefore, it was easy to imagine the pressure that Dalang was under when faced with matriarch He, who was his grandmother. Although He Sanlang had some measure of power in the household, he was still one of the youngest in the family and he didn't hold any authority towards his brother. Even if he were to persuade him sincerely, He Dalang simply wouldn't listen. The only person who could overturn the decisions of the matriarch and He Changchi would be his father, Count Jingan. Hearing He Sanlang's explanation, Chu Lian hastily interjected, "Didn't you say that father is returning soon? Let's write a letter to notify him about this matter." Chu Lian's suggestion made sense to him. He Changdi quickly got up, walked to the writing desk, and begun writing a letter. Once the letter had been sent out by Wenlan, the couple finally relaxed their tense shoulders. As long as Count Jingan managed to return in time, the marriage between He Dalang and Pan Yenjin wouldn't happen. Chu Lian and He Changdi then chatted for a little more before having their afternoon nap together. Within a room in Qingxi Hall, Pan Yenjin was lying on the bed. She had already cried to the point of passing out several times. When she had been caught with her pants down by He Changdi and Chu Lian this morning, it had felt as if she had been struck by lightning. Her mind had collapsed instantly. Until now, she still refused to believe that the person she had mustered up her courage to give up her body to was actually the tall, bear-like He Changchi. The Prince Charming she had been dreaming about turned into a black bear. Pan Yenjin wanted to slam her head into the wall and kill herself, but she managed to stop herself from doing that with what was left of her rationality. Although she hated the situation right now, she didn't have the courage to hang herself. Moments later, He Ying entered. Seeing her pale and haggard-looking daughter, she helplessly sighed. She walked up to her daughter and sat by the bedside. "Miss Zhen, mother arranged everything perfectly for you. How did you make a mistake?" He Ying may have been a selfish shrew, but she treated her only daughter well. Otherwise, she wouldn't have groomed Pan Yenjin into what she was. Pan Yenjin didn't dare to tell her mother the truth now. How could she reveal that she hadn't intended to follow the plan at all? Her target from the very beginning wasn't He Erlang, it was He Sanlang. The servant who had told He Changdi that Chu Lian was sleeping had been bought by her. "Mother, my mind was in a daze then. I don't know how I made the mistake." At the mention of the incident, the floodgates were opened once again. Tears fell freely from Pan Nyanzan's eyes, which were already swollen from all her crying. She threw herself into He Ying's embrace and wailed, "Mother, what should I do? I can't live on anymore." He Ying wanted to admonish her daughter for having foiled the plan. She had arranged everything to perfection, yet her daughter had somehow made a mistake. However, looking at her daughter's state, she lost the will to reprimand her. She sighed and said, "What else can we do? You have no choice but to marry Dalang now." There was decisiveness in her tone. Pan Yenjin sobbed, she obviously didn't want this. Chapter 587. Becoming the Countess is good too. 2. He Ying knew her daughter well and she could read her daughter's thoughts like a book. Amongst the three young masters of the He family, He Sanlang was undoubtedly the best in terms of appearance, while He Erlang was second. Coming in last was the eldest, He Dalang, who resembled Count Jingan the most and wasn't very appealing. However, He Sanlang had just married last year, while He Dalang hadn't even been in their considerations originally. Well, but who could have seen his divorce coming? He didn't even have a son yet, so thinking about it now, he was actually a great choice as well. When a lady chooses her husband, she can't make a decision based on the prettiness of his looks alone, she had to consider his status as well. Pan Yenjin looked back up with teary eyes, resisting her mother's decision timidly. But, I don't like eldest cousin. He Ying truly hated how her daughter couldn't see the big picture. Right now, it didn't matter whether she liked him or not. She had already given her virginity to him, so she no longer had a choice. But she couldn't bring herself to break this to her daughter, so she tried to console her from a different angle. Your eldest cousin's looks may be average, but has the heir of the estate. When your uncle retires, his countship will be passed down to him. By marrying your eldest cousin, you'll become Countess Jingan in the future. Your eldest cousin doesn't have a son yet, so if you bear a son for him, you'll produce the next heir to House Jingan's future heir. That will only make your grandmother love you even more. He Ying's kind persuasion made a visible change to Pan Nyanzan's expression, but no one knew how she actually felt inside. An hour later, He Ying got up. All right, I've said my piece. You should think for yourself whether my words make any sense to you. Pan Yenjin nodded dazedly, and He Ying bent over to stroke her daughter's hair. With a sigh, she left Pan Nyanzan's room. After He Ying left, Pan Yenjin remained seated on the bed for a long time. Suddenly, she raised her head to look at the servant by her side. Pinglu, do you think I should just resign myself to my fate? Pinglu lowered her head as she didn't dare look into Pan Nyanzan's eyes. Her eyes darted around the room for a few moments before she softly replied, This servant doesn't dare to make such a statement. However, it didn't seem like Pan Yenjin was looking for an answer from her at all. She gazed at the floor. At a volume that only she could hear, she muttered, I just can't accept this. The moment Xiao Bojian left 6th Prince's estate, he received a letter from one. Xiao Bojian first boarded the carriage with the letter in hand, while one followed him into the carriage shortly after. Once one had taken a seat, his master asked, Who is it from? One shook his head, This subordinate doesn't know, this subordinate received it from a child on the streets. The child said that it's for you. And the child? I've already interrogated him. The child knows nothing. He was given a little money to pass on the letter. A sinister cast fell over Xiao Bojian's face for a moment. He opened the letter, and quickly skimmed through its contents. When he was done digesting the contents of the letter, his eyes widened in disbelief, while the hand with which he was holding the letter trembled. Xiao Bojian's incredibly beautiful face suddenly turned flushed. It wasn't due to anger at all, but excitement. He gripped the letter tightly while trying his utmost to contain the rising excitement that was about to explode. However, he was still young. He didn't have the mature calm and shrewdness of his previous lifetime. When one saw that his master's face had tensed up and become a little contorted, seemingly trying to suppress his emotions and failing to, he became concerned and asked, Master, is something wrong? One's question helped to pull Xiao Bojian back to reality. Xiao Bojian quickly readjusted the expression on his face and threw the letter into the brazier in the carriage. The fire flashed once, and the letter was reduced to ashes. Chapter 588, Fainting, 1, It's nothing. I have some tasks for you. Send some men to do them quickly, and find some leads as soon as you can. Xiao Bojian's voice contained a thread of excitement and impatience. Since his master hadn't replied him, one didn't press for an answer. After receiving Xiao Bojian's orders, he leaped out of the carriage to look for his subordinates. Sitting alone in the carriage, Xiao Bojian leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. A few seconds later, he let out a burst of laughter. With this gift from the heavens, he finally stood a real chance to fulfill the revenge he had suffered so much for. He had suffered in silence for so many years, all because he wanted his foes to have a taste of the pain and humiliation his family had received all those years ago. When his thoughts veered off in that direction, Killing intent flashed in his eyes. How had the sender of that letter gotten a hold of all those secrets? This wasn't the first time. Back in Suching, he had received an anonymous letter just like this that had told him all sorts of useful secrets, but he hadn't been able to find the sender then, either. It was as if there was someone in the background who had knowledge of everything that was going to happen. That person was stealthily making plans to maximize their benefits from each event. That line of thought made Xiao Bojian shake his head. He had never believed in the supernatural, so how could he possibly consider such a conjecture? No matter who the person leaking secrets to him was, no matter how good they were at hiding their identity, he was going to find that person and make sure to shut his mouth forever. There was one fact he had learned very well. No living man could keep a secret better than a dead man could. Mu Xiang was in a heated room in Qingxi Hall directing some servants when she suddenly felt a chill go down her back. At its touch, she couldn't help but do a full-body shiver. Immediately after, she hunkered down into her shoulders, finding the chill a little strange. However, she didn't think any more of it. Mu Xiang had been given the chance to reincarnate with all the memories from her previous lifetime. Those memories had become her greatest advantage. Since she already knew everything that was going to happen, who could escape from her claws? This time, she would lead even the smart and cunning Xiao Bojian by the nose. It wasn't even evening when He Changdi returned early today. Chu Lian felt bored after staying in the study for most of the day, so she begged He Sanlang to teach her some martial arts. He Changdi was no match for his wife's soft pleading, so he had no choice but to bring her over to the training room. Chu Lian didn't have any foundation in martial arts, but she had received lessons from Wenqing and Wenlan before, so her moves seemed to have some proper form. He Sanlang was astonished by what he saw. When did you learn martial arts secretly? Chu Lian picked up a dry cloth hanging on a nearby screen and wiped away her sweat. What do you mean secretly? Why would I even need to learn martial arts in secret? I've been doing it openly, alright? He Changdi taught Chu Lian a simple set of defensive moves by moving her body with his hands. He had assumed that Chu Lian was just in a whimsical phase that would die out quickly, but they unexpectedly managed to train for over an hour. It was now spring. Despite wearing a loose, short-sleeved garment for exercising, this bout of training made Chu Lian's face completely flushed. Even her back was soaked. He Sanlang took out Chu Lian's handkerchief to wipe away her sweat, then used his large palms to check her warm, flushed face. A slight furrow formed on his brows. It's fine to train a little for fun, but why are you trying so hard as if your life depends on it? Chu Lian pulled him to a bench where they sat together and drank the warm water Wenqing had brought. She puffed up her cheeks and said, "A skill only belongs to you when you learn it properly. Besides, I was just doing my best. I'm not working that hard. You're overestimating me." He Sanlang showed a slight smile as he reached over to push Chu Lian's wet fringe to the side. You have Wenqing and Wenlan, and if something happens, I'll be by your side. It's very tiring to learn martial arts. The noble ladies of the Great Wu dynasty pursued petite physiques, with emphasis on appearing delicate. Some ladies would even cut down on meals to maintain their figures, so practicing martial arts was unheard of amongst them. These days, it was rare even for the daughters of the military families to learn martial arts. Despite all that, Chu Lian was going against the flow. It was a mystery how that little head of hers worked. The look in He Changdi's eyes darkened. He suddenly recalled that in his previous life, Chu Lian hadn't shown any semblance of appreciation or adoration whenever she saw him heading to the training room. There had even been disdain in her eyes. To her, military officials were always lower than court officials, and she held martial arts in contempt. Chu Lian shook her head. Training in the martial arts is good for health and strength. At my age, I don't hope to become skilled at it, but I still want to learn some moves just in case. Besides, it's not like you can carry me around everywhere, right? Amused by her words, He Sanlang openly laughed out loud like never before. Unable to resist temptation, he then stroked his wife's soft, smooth cheek. From here on out, I shall tie you to my waist, and take you wherever I go. Chu Lian blinked at him. Do you mean that for real? You're not joking? I wouldn't dare lie to you. Chu Lian noticed that this fellow was becoming more and more of a smooth talker. He Sanlang hadn't sweated much, but Chu Lian was very tired, so he waited patiently for his wife to recover as she rested in the training room. He suddenly thought of something. There's something I need to tell you. House Ying intends to have your fifth sister marry Xiao Bojian. What? Surprised, Chu Lian raised her head and looked towards He Changdi. I've heard that it's already been decided in secret, but it hasn't been made public. If nothing unexpected happens, there will probably be news of it in a few days. Xiao Bojian and Miss Su? Chu Lian's thoughts raced. She recalled the kind warning Miss Su gave her a few days back at House Ying. Chapter 589, Fainting, 2. Do you think this is a scheme by Xiao Bojian, or something else? He Changdi narrowed his eyes a little. Probably both. With Chu Yuan's reputation in the dregs, the only lady of marriageable age in House Ying is your fifth sister. There was a hidden meaning behind He Sanlang's words, but Chu Lian was able to understand what he meant. Neither Miss Yuan nor Miss Su had pure motives. Back then, Chu Lian had even been worried for Miss Su, afraid that her fifth sister would miss the best time of her youth due to various delays. She had thought of helping Miss Su with finding a husband after she moved out of House Jinggan. However, if Miss Su had set her eyes on Xiao Bojian, then there was no need for her to do anything. Honestly, it wasn't as if Miss Su had betrayed her for her own interests, or had some devilish plot brewing. Miss Su had to think for herself. Although Chu Lian had become a chess piece in her game, when one thought of things from a different angle, Miss Su hadn't done any harm to Chu Lian at all. All Miss Su had done was to seize what she wanted with her own hands. Only Miss Su herself knew whether it was good for her or not. He Changdi patted Chu Lian's shoulder. Chu Lian knew that He Changdi meant to console her. He probably knew that the only person she had a good impression of in the entire House Ying was their fifth miss, Chu Su. That was why he informed her about this in advance. By the time the couple left the training room, it was already dinner time. After dinner, Chu Lian informed He Changdi about the matter of Countess Jinggan managing the household and the estate lacking funds. She then waved at Xian to have her and two servants bring in a box with the cloisonné vase. This is what mother pawned away. I got one of the servants to buy it back in secret. You should return it to mother later. He Changdi abruptly took a step forward and hugged Chu Lian tightly. This sudden action made all of the servants in the room lower their heads in fright. He buried his face into Chu Lian's fair neck and placed a kiss there. Next, he went up to her ear and whispered, Liana, I'm so lucky to have you. Chu Lian was first shocked by his actions, then astonished. When she heard his smooth, deep voice right by her ear, her heart melted as well. With a blush on her face, she grumbled, You've only just realized how lucky you are. It was at this time that the tactful senior servant Gui chased all of the servants in the room out. With only the two of them left in the room, He Changdi stooped over, his long arms hooked under her knees, and scooped her up. He then walked towards the bedroom with long strides. Chu Lian cried out in alarm and put her arms around his neck in a panic. She glared at him with her beautiful, almond-shaped eyes and exclaimed, What are you doing? He Sanlang lowered his head and blew at the top of her reddened ear. With a deep, enthralling voice, he replied, Doing you. Chu Lian. Since when had He Changdi become an expert at teasing? Chu Lian was extremely vexed, but she couldn't help the fact that she was weaker than him. She couldn't fight him at all. Any attempts to protest were immediately smothered by his mouth, so all that was left was her feeble moans. For some time, the bedroom was filled with the sounds of love. By the time He Changdi was properly satiated, it was already late in the evening. It didn't seem possible for him to return Countess Jinggan's vase that night. The next day, He Changdi personally brought the cloisonné vase to his mother's courtyard before leaving to attend court. Chu Lian headed to Qingxi Hall for greetings alongside her mother-in-law, Countess Jinggan. Although Countess Jinggan didn't put a voice to her thoughts, the appreciative, loving look in her eyes gave her away. Countess Jinggan held Chu Lian's hand as they walked past the garden. It was now the beginning of March, so it was no longer chilly in the capital. Buds of green had begun to reveal themselves in the garden. The winter jasmine, which acted as a herald of spring, was now at the peak of its blooming. The pair of mother and daughter-in-law were walking past shrubs of winter jasmine at this time. "Liana, Sanlang has already spoken to me, so I won't say anything else. You're a good child, so spend your days happily with Sanlang. If he bullies you, let me know and I'll punish him for you." Chu Lian hugged Countess Jingan's arm. "Mother, would you really be willing to? You spent 10 months being pregnant to give birth to him." Countess Jingan rolled her eyes at her. "His skin is so thick and sturdy, why wouldn't I help you punish him? I gave birth to 3 sons, yet they all give me endless worries." Perhaps her words had reminded herself of the state of He Dalang and He Erlang's marriages, so all traces of the happy expression on her face vanished. Chu Lian noticed her mother-in-law's mood souring, so she quickly tried to console her. "Mother, don't think about it too much, just hang in there a little longer. Father will return soon, he definitely won't allow the marriage between eldest brother and Miss Zhen." Countess Jingan nodded, "That's our only solution for now." Unfortunately, when they arrived at Qingxi Hall, He Ying mentioned the matter to Matriarch He and Countess Jingan once again. The matriarch had been persuaded by her daughter to see it her way. With the additional guilt she felt towards her daughter and granddaughter, she was really considering betrothing Pan Nianzhen to He Dalang as his second wife now. The exchanges between the matriarch and He Ying immediately brought Countess Jingan's anger to its peak, and she fainted. Chu Lian was seated by Countess Jingan's side at the time. She was shocked by this development and quickly called in servants to carry Countess Jingan to the side room. She ordered another servant to look for Great Dr. Miao. He Ying hadn't expected her sister-in-law to be so fragile as to faint from anger in just 2 sentences. At the same time, this made her apprehensive. She tugged on Matriarch He's sleeve and looked anxiously at the matriarch. Matriarch He hadn't expected this to happen either, but there was no point in crying over spilt milk. She sent an indifferent glare at her daughter in response. Chapter 591, He Ying's Accusations, 2a. "Miss Ying, don't cry. My head hurts now." He Ying hastily stopped her waterworks. She grabbed the matriarch's hand and began making malicious accusations. "Mother, don't believe in sister-in-law. She must have been pretending today. If she wasn't, then why would the doctor say she was fine? That great Dr. Miao is clearly on the side of Sanlang's wife. She treats him well and serves him good food and drinks in the estate every day. So, has already biased towards their side. Perhaps it was all just an act prepared by sister-in-law and Sanlang's wife just for us to watch. Oh, our poor Miss Zhen, her purity has been stolen away." She began to sniffle and sob again as she spoke. The matriarch was getting swayed by her daughter. Her wrinkle-filled face was grim. It was clear that her mood had taken a turn for the worse because of He Ying's words. He Ying noticed that her mother was beginning to waver, so she continued, "Mother, you know that brother doesn't like me. Brother is coming back soon. When brother returns, he'll definitely oppose this marriage. If that happens, then Miss Zhen's whole life will be ruined. This must all be part of sister-in-law's plan." Although she felt that her daughter's words were rather twisted, there were also some truths in them. The matriarch had actually started to think more deeply on the matter. "Mother, I'm your only daughter and Miss Zhen is your only granddaughter from my side. When I was young, I didn't get to grow up beside you. Every day, what I hoped for the most was to see you and father. At that time, when I stayed with grandmother, I would always get laughed at for not having parents. After father passed away, mother is the only one I have now." He Ying's words triggered the deep sense of guilt within the matriarch's heart. The matriarch was wavering even more now. "Mother, weren't you the one who requested the Empress Dowager to arrange a marriage for Sanlang at that time? Sanlang and his brothers are all junior members of the family. If you arrange a marriage for them, would they be able to refuse? Dalang is almost 30, but he still doesn't have a legitimate son. Do you want him to become the laughingstock of the capital? When a man got older but remained without a heir, he would certainly be criticized by outsiders. For people around the same age as he Dalang, if they had gotten married at a young age, their children would already be over 10 years old. If their first child was a girl, then she might even have come of age. Mother. All right, I understand. Stop nagging me. I'll send in a request to meet the Empress Dowager and enter the palace tomorrow. He Ying was pleasantly surprised when she heard the promise. Her eyes lit up and she said, Mother, you're so kind to me and Miss Jun. I haven't felt such warmth for many years. This remark was undoubtedly meant as a dig at the matriarch's weakness again. The matriarch was exhausted, so she waved her hand to signal He Ying to leave. He Ying had already accomplished her goal, so she didn't need to stay any longer. The corner of her lips curved up. Mother, you should have a good rest. I'll go prepare some nourishing soup for you. After He Ying left, the matriarch sighed and summoned senior servant Liu. She ordered her to take her personal jade token and send it to the palace. Senior servant Liu was in disbelief. The matriarch was actually going to enter the palace to ask for the Empress Dowager's help because of what eldest madam had said. She hesitated to speak as she clenched the jade token in her hand. However, she swallowed her words when she saw the matriarch's pale complexion. She bobbed towards the matriarch and left. Mu Xiang was standing beside them, so she had naturally heard the matriarch and He Ying's entire conversation. She smirked, not intending to interfere with this matter. It would be better if the main branch and second branch were ruined. Once she became He Chengdi's wife again, it would be an easy matter to take control of House Jinggan in that state. After she left Qingxi Hall, senior servant Liu grew even more worried the more she thought about it. Eldest madam talked and behaved recklessly. If He Chengqi really married Pan Nianzhen, wouldn't the entire House Jinggan be ruined by them? She summoned a trustworthy maidservant and whispered into her ears. Then, she ordered her to quickly send her message to Songtao Court. When the maidservant arrived at Songtao Court, Chu Lian had just finished teaching Xian to cook mutton soup. Senior servant Gui brought the messenger inside. Chu Lian carefully examined the maidservant from head to toe a couple of times, feeling that she looked slightly familiar. Who ordered you to come here? For what reason? The maidservant promptly kneeled down and recounted everything senior servant Liu had told her to say. Chu Lian's eyes widened as she listened to her. She hadn't thought that eldest madam would actually dare to involve the Empress Dowager in her plans. How ridiculous. Moreover, the matriarch had actually gone with her nonsense. Chu Lian dismissed the maidservant. She thought about it and felt that she couldn't just ignore this matter. Thus, she gathered her servants and went to Prince Weiss Estate. When they reached the main entrance of Prince Weiss Estate, Chu Lian had someone send in a message for her. A few moments later, senior servant Lan personally came to greet her. Senior servant Lan happily led Chu Lian into the estate. For honored lady to come at this time, is there an urgent matter? Chu Lian told her truthfully, Momo, to tell you honestly, I really did come to seek Princess Weiss' help. Senior servant Lan smiled. Honored lady is really lucky. Princess Wei just returned from Mount Lanxiang yesterday. She just happened to be free today and didn't go out. There was a temple at Mount Lanxiang, said to be the place where Empress Xiaoxian became a nun. The members of the imperial family would visit the temple once or twice every year to pray. It had already become a tradition. Is Royal Princess Duanjia here as well? Royal Princess is still at Mount Lanxiang. The young prince is accompanying her, so you won't have to worry about her, honored lady. Mount Lanxiang was famed for its beautiful scenery and it was close to the capital. It was currently early spring, when Mother Nature awakened from her long slumber. Thus, it was the best time for an outing. Royal Princess Duanjia had invited her to go together a few days ago. However, Chu Lian had rejected her offer because there were too many things happening in the estate. Chapter 592, Nanjing Cuisine, 1. As Chu Lian was speaking with Senior Servant Lan, they arrived at the circular arched door that lead to the inner court. Senior Servant Lan called for a sedan. She helped Chu Lian in before two strong senior servants carried it into the inner court. Princess Wei had already been notified and was waiting for her arrival. Chu Lian wasn't taken to Princess Wei's courtyard. Instead, she was brought over to a pondside pavilion. Princess Wei was currently drawing inside. The warm sunshine shone on the surface of the pond water. A gentle breeze blew, causing the surface to glimmer as if 1,000 silver snakes were dancing along the water ripples. Half of the octagonal pavilion was covered by curtains, leaving only a single entrance. This was to keep the sunlight out while also maintaining air circulation. The scenery of the lotus pond was still visible from within as well. While the lotus pond was mostly covered in withered old plants, there were a few fresh green buds emerging beyond the surface of the water. The small lotus leaves stood suspended above, perfectly straight. The sight of the calm, vibrant spring scenery lifted Chu Lian's mood slightly. She couldn't help but walk faster towards the octagonal pavilion. Princess Wei seemed to have seen her coming, as she had already set down her paintbrush. She was in the middle of sipping some tea while seated at a stone table. When Chu Lian was brought into the pavilion by Senior Servant Lan, Princess Wei smiled and said, "Genie, come and sit beside me." The corner of Chu Lian's lips curved up, exposing the two faint dimples on her cheeks. She always felt very relaxed whenever she was beside Princess Wei. She bobbed in greeting towards Princess Wei before taking a seat beside her. Princess Wei held Chu Lian's hand in hers as they chatted. Chu Lian immediately noticed the incomplete painting on the easel beside them. "Your drawing is amazing, Princess." When Princess Wei was younger, she had been famed for her talents within the capital. She was proficient in the 4 womanly arts, the zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. Although she didn't paint as much now, her skills hadn't deteriorated at all. "It's not that good. I didn't have anything to do today, so I was just painting to pass the time," Princess Wei said with a smile. "It's much better than my paintings," Chu Lian genuinely complimented. She only knew how to sketch with chalks and pencils, due to her profession as a designer back in modern times. However, she didn't know anything about traditional Chinese paintings. "Good child, you have such a sweet mouth. Duanjia has showed me your jewelry designs before. They were so real, it looked as if the jewelry had been sewn onto the paper." Chu Lian blushed. She had specially added color to her sketches so that the craftsman could imagine the details more clearly. "Why did you suddenly think of me today?" "It's rare for you to take the initiative to come visit me," Princess Wei said, giving her a glare. The smile on Chu Lian's face faded. "Princess Wei, I came to seek your help this time." "Oh." Princess Wei lifted a brow and looked at Chu Lian, who was sitting beside her. The young lady was staring at her with big, clear eyes. She looked exactly like an innocent, naive little fawn. Princess Wei couldn't resist pinching Chu Lian's smooth and rosy cheeks. "I knew it. You wouldn't come visit me unless you needed my help." Chu Lian was embarrassed by her remark, but she told Princess Wei the whole story anyway. On the other side of the lotus pond, 2 middle-aged men were strolling leisurely near some decorative mountains. One of them was wearing a purple robe embroidered with the legendary animal, Chileen. He possessed an elegant aura and tall stature. At this time, with a faint smile on his face, he was pointing out the scenery within the estate's inner court to another middle-aged man dressed in a dark blue robe. The man in the dark blue robe had a deep, piercingly cold gaze. His hands were clasped behind his back as he walked along the cobblestone path. From time to time, one could hear his jubilant laughter. "Ninth brother, I haven't visited your estate in a long time." Prince Wei, the man in purple, cheerfully laughed along. "Elder brother is busy with the country's affairs every day, unlike me. I'm just leisurely passing my days. I've renovated this garden twice already." The Emperor and Prince Wei were full-blooded brothers. The Emperor had doted on Prince Wei since their youth. Later on, when all the princes had been fighting for the throne, Prince Wei had supported his elder brother. Thus, the relationship between the two brothers became even closer. Prince Wei was undoubtedly the one the emperor trusted the most within the entire imperial court. The emperor was dressed in ordinary clothing. If one didn't notice his imposing aura, he would seem just like an idle rich man at first glance. The emperor rarely had the time to come out of the palace, so he didn't want to think about annoying political affairs on his time off. He gazed upon the huge lotus pond, and then even farther into the distance. He chuckled and said, "Younger sister-in-law seems to be in a good mood, drawing in the pavilion at this time. Is the young lady beside her Duanjia? That silly girl hasn't visited the palace in a long time. Her imperial grandmother has mentioned several times that she misses her." Prince Wei looked towards the octagonal pavilion from afar and just happened to see the joyful smile on his wife's face. Chu Lian's back was facing them right now. From this angle, if Prince Wei hadn't known that Duanjia wasn't in the estate, then he might also have mistaken her for his daughter. "Elder brother, you're mistaken this time. That's not Duanjia. That silly girl, Duanjia, is likely still playing at Lanxiang Mountain and delaying her return." The emperor was somewhat shocked. Chapter 593, Nanjing Cuisine, 2, Elder brother, since Jeannie came over, let's have her prepare some dishes for you to try. That child is a talented cook. I don't know where she learned it, but I think she's a better cook than the imperial cooks of the palace. The emperor collected his gaze and smiled. Then he'll stay to taste Jinyi's cooking today. He had only seen Chu Lian once, before the new year. After that, he had been preoccupied with all the government affairs, so he had nearly forgotten about it. However, when he thought about it now, he realized that he still remembered it very clearly. Chu Lian had originally come to seek Princess Wei's help, but she was somehow turned into a cook. Chu Lian still didn't know that she was cooking for the emperor. She just thought that she was cooking to show filial piety to Prince and Princess Wei. She inquired about the foods that Prince and Princess Wei couldn't eat, then brought senior servant Lan, Wenqing, and Wenlan over to the estate's kitchen. The kitchen in Prince Wei's estate had all the necessary ingredients. Chu Lian always carried some spices and seasonings with her, so she wasn't afraid that they would lack anything. It was early spring now, so hot and spicy dishes were out of the question. It was also the time when wild herbs were the freshest and richest. There was a small garden close to the kitchen. Chu Lian walked around and saw an array of delicious fresh vegetables. She instructed a maidservant to gather the vegetables that she needed and bring them to the kitchen. Chu Lian personally picked out some fresh mugwort and wild chrysanthemums. She ordered Wenqing to prepare some freshwater shrimp and fish, and then she told Wenlan to make minced meat. She wanted to make light and healthy dishes. There were also many spring ingredients available, so making Nanjing cuisine was definitely the best choice. Nanjing cuisine had a mild taste that was fresh and crisp. The dishes looked delicate and exquisite with an elegant touch. Therefore, it was the most well-suited cuisine for the early spring season. Chu Lian decided on several dishes that wouldn't take very long to cook. The 5 dishes were completed in an hour. Each dish was placed in a porcelain plate of a different style, then decorated with fresh flowers. The bright colors drew in both the eye and the belly. Princess Wei had informed her beforehand that Prince Wei would be dining separately from them, so Chu Lian prepared 2 servings for each dish. Then, Chu Lian instructed some servants to bring along the dishes that she was going to eat with Princess Wei, while Wenqing brought the other set over to the outer court. Within the parlor of the outer court, Prince Wei and the emperor were already seated and drinking tea. An imperial guard outside reported that the dishes had arrived. With a wave of his hand, the emperor signaled and said, "Set the table." Senior servant Lan entered the parlor first, followed by Wenqing and the maidservants carrying lacquer boxes filled with dishes. Wenqing knew that Prince Wei was in the outer court. She had seen Prince Wei before when she had followed Chu Lian to Prince Wei's estate. At first, she had thought that Prince Wei would be the only one present. Perhaps the eldest royal prince might also be in attendance, but it was unlikely there would be anyone else. However, she was greeted with the sight of an unfamiliar middle-aged man. When she lifted her head and took a peek at him, She was shocked by his imposing aura. She immediately bowed her head in a proper manner. Someone who could sit at the same table with Prince Wei as an equal and had a rather close relationship with the prince definitely wasn't an ordinary man. After understanding this point, Wenqing became even more disciplined. Senior servant Lan instructed the maidservants to bring out the dishes from within the lacquer boxes and place them on the table one at a time. After that, she said with a smile, "Masters, please enjoy your meal." These were all personally made by honored Lady Genie. 5 porcelain plates of different shapes and colors were placed on the table. Princess Wei had specially ordered her handmaid to find these porcelain plates. They were all very valuable, but the food inside looked even better. Its allure couldn't be underestimated. It could even be said that these porcelain plates had become accompaniments for the food. The Chengping Emperor's eyes lit up. He pointed at the dishes that looked even more exquisite than artworks and questioned, "Quick, tell me, what are all these?" Although Prince Wei thought it was a pity that the roast duck he had eaten last time wasn't on the table, he was also very eager to taste the fragrant delicacies that were currently in front of him. Wenqing came forward and introduced each of the dishes, just as Chu Lian had taught her. Replying to masters, these stir-fried vegetables are called Nanjing grass, which is made from the most tender parts of the tips of Chinese mugwort. It was stir-fried with light seasonings and has a naturally fresh taste. The dish beside it is phoenix tail prawns. The freshest river prawns were selected for this dish. After peeling off the head, the prawn is covered in egg whites and other seasonings, then fried in fragrant duck oil. Wenqing gave a simple introduction for all 5 dishes. As each dish was introduced, the Emperor and Prince Wei would taste the dish. Upon tasting the first dish, the Emperor's eyes were immediately set alight. The fresh mugwort was originally tender and fragrant, and its flavor was complemented by the simplest of seasonings, oil and salt. When cooked at the right temperature, it would highlight the natural taste of the mugwort. There were also bright red Chinese roses adorning the dish, and the visual impact caused by the contrasting red and green appealed to the senses, stimulating the appetite. The freshwater prawns had pure white meat with bright red shells. They were arranged on the plate in the shape of a phoenix tail. Green beans were placed beside them, creating a gorgeous mixture of vibrant colors. The prawns were fresh and tender, and the batter was crispy and delicious in the mouth, without being greasy. The duck oil they were cooked in had imparted a special aroma to the prawns. These 2 dishes had already conquered the Emperor, so it went without saying for the other dishes: steamed fish belly, crispy eel, and wild chrysanthemum soup. Chapter 594, Scolding the Matriarch. 1. This was when the Chengping Emperor finally understood why so many people had been so frustrated and dissatisfied when Guilin Restaurant had first shut its doors, and why they had written so many angry letters to complain to House Jingan when the restaurant had reopened without any of its original flavor. After eating such marvelous cuisine, he realized that what he had been eating for the past few decades couldn't even be called delicacies. The Emperor was starting to become jealous of his younger brother. Wenqing had already been escorted out by senior servant Lan after she finished introducing the 5 dishes. Despite his usual control over his food portions, the Emperor's mind wasn't able to restrain the raging appetite of his stomach, and he ate 3 whole bowls of rice that day. This was more than he had eaten in a single meal in years. The large portions of the 5 dishes disappeared into the imperial brothers' bellies in less than 20 minutes. Eunuch Wei, who was dressed up as a normal manservant, watched with wide eyes in shock. Although he wanted to remind the Emperor that eating so much wasn't good for his health, he himself was drooling from all the food. "I didn't expect Jinyi's cooking to be so good." The Emperor rubbed his bloated tummy, satisfied beyond belief. He had never felt so fulfilled in years. It wasn't Prince Wei's first time tasting Chu Lian's cooking. He had had the same thoughts while enjoying the roast duck she had made last time. That reminded Prince Wei of something. He wriggled his brows as he said, "Brother, you haven't tried the roast duck that Genie makes yet. Now that's the best duck I've ever eaten. There isn't enough time today, or I would have asked her to make another roast duck for us." "Oh, roast duck. How does it compare to the one that father used to eat? The two brothers had inherited their love of roast duck from the previous emperor. While he had still been alive, he would eat roast duck every few days. Later on, when his health had declined and the imperial physicians advised the emperor to avoid oily foods, he had still eaten roast duck on the sly. Prince Wei sent his brother a mysterious smile. "Brother, allow me to keep you in suspense for this. You'll know whether it's good or not once Jeannie opens her restaurant. You can go there yourself in incognito to taste it then." "Oh, she's going to open another restaurant. What happened with the other one, Guilin restaurant?" Since the emperor was asking, Prince Wei explained the incident to him simply. The emperor frowned. House Jingan's matriarch wasn't right in this case. Prince Wei smiled. Although they could comment on these kinds of incidents, they wouldn't really take any action due to their high status. If they were to interfere even in these small matters, then their citizens would likely think that the imperial family had too much time on their hands. The empty dishes on the table were cleared and fresh censure was placed in front of the two imperial brothers. It was rare for them to have these carefree afternoon moments. The emperor suddenly asked, "Why did Jeannie visit you today, ninth brother?" One of Prince Wei's attendants had already informed him of the reason Chu Lian had come to the estate. Thus, Prince Wei replied honestly to his brother's direct question. The Chengping emperor frowned again. "What? There's such a thing? What nonsense. The Jingan estate is in a terrible mess now. I should have summoned Count Jingan back earlier." Prince Wei shook his head. "These are all matters for the inner courts. Brother, you don't have to worry too much about this. My wife will help Jeannie settle this when the time comes." The emperor chatted a while longer with his brother before eunuch Wei politely reminded him that it was about time to return to the palace. When Prince Wei sent the emperor off at the side entrance, they happened to catch sight of Chu Lian and her maidservants leaving. The emperor froze for a moment, but he quickly recovered and turned to Prince Wei. "I'll entrust the planning for the Thousand Blessings Festival to you then, ninth brother. Don't make it too ostentatious. Rest assured, brother. I'll keep that in mind. I won't spend too much or waste resources." Having gotten Prince Wei's promise, the emperor finally left the estate with his entourage in tow. The Thousand Blessings Festival was on the 23rd of March. It was also the emperor's 50th birthday this year, one of the major milestones in life. Furthermore, this year happened to be Chengping 20, the 20th year since the Chengping emperor had taken the throne and began his wise rule. In the past years, the emperor had ordered the celebrations for the Thousand Blessings Festival to be kept simple. The ministers of the court approved of the emperor's frugal ways. He always kept the celebrations low-key unless it was a major milestone. While it was good enough to hold a simple event for other years, since it was his 50th birthday this year, they couldn't just pass it over without a proper celebration. Even the Empress Dowager, who normally didn't interfere in politics or the inner courts of the palace, had ordered that this year's celebrations had to be much bigger than in the past. Prince Wei didn't touch politics and was trusted by the emperor, so he was the best person to plan the banquet this year. Thus, the emperor had given him one last reminder before leaving. After they left Prince Wei's estate, the emperor boarded an unassuming green carriage under the protection of his bodyguards. Right as he entered the carriage, the emperor sent a meaningful look at the Yulin army commander, He Lin, who was dressed as a normal martial artist. He Lin looked around him before quickly following the emperor into the carriage. He Lin made a cupped fist salute as he kneeled on one knee before the emperor and said, "Your Majesty, how may I be of service?" The emperor was leaning against the wall, his gaze directed far away. His tone was calm, without any particular emotions in it. However, He Lin had served the emperor for many years and he could sense that the emperor was giving off a dangerous air right now. "Send some spies to investigate House Ying's second master. We want to know everything about him." "Yes, this subordinate will do as your Majesty has ordered." He Lin didn't dare to tarry a second longer. He turned and jumped off the carriage, leaping onto his steed. Urging his horse on, he quickly disappeared around the end of the small alley. Chu Lian heaved a sigh of relief after leaving Prince Wei's estate and boarding her carriage. Before she had left, Princess Wei had promised to help her block the jade token that matriarch he had sent to the palace. As long as the matriarch was held back from meeting the Empress Dowager before her father-in-law, Count Jingan, returned, all would be fine. Chapter 595, Scolding the Matriarch, 2. It was evening by the time Chu Lian returned to the Jingan estate, only to find a summons from the matriarch waiting. Chu Lian didn't even have time to return to Songtao Court to change out of her clothes. Within the parlor of Qingxi Hall, the matriarch was resting her head in her hands while seated at the head of the room. Eldest Madam He Ying was glaring fiercely at her. Chu Lian had just finished bobbing in greeting to the matriarch when He Ying shot out a question. Sanlang's wife. Where have you been? Chu Lian knew that she couldn't hide that she had gone to Prince Wei's estate. There were so many servants in the estate, one of them had surely seen where she had gone. The matriarch didn't invite her to take a seat, so she remained standing upright in the middle of the parlor. Although her voice was soft, her tone was calm. Replying to Aunt, I went to visit Princess Wei today. Why would you go to visit Prince Wei's estate without any reason? Prince Wei's estate hasn't sent you any invites as of late. Sanlang's wife, are you trying to break up Miss Zhen and Darlang's marriage? He Ying's face was twisted into a wretched expression and her face was flushed an ugly red. It was clear that she had lost all sense of rhyme or reason. Chu Lian frowned with her lips pressed together. She didn't want to answer He Ying. Had the matriarch summoned her so urgently just for this matter? How absurd. He Ying stood on the raised platform, her eyes fixed on Chu Lian's pretty, young face. She was already hopping mad, but Chu Lian was as steady as a pine. She was acting like she was watching some monkeys playing around, and the look in her eyes was bordering on contempt. The matriarch wasn't too happy either. However, while she could hold back her rage with her years of experience, He Ying wasn't able to keep her cool. Seeing that Chu Lian didn't want to reply her, He Ying stepped forward and raised her hand, intending to bring it down on Chu Lian's fair, tender cheek. Wenqing was shaken upon seeing what was about to happen, but unfortunately, she was standing at least 2 meters behind Chu Lian at the moment. She wouldn't be able to block the slap for Chu Lian in time. He Ying was enraged, so her slap carried all the force she could summon. She had thought that the tiny and frail Chu Lian would be pushed down to the floor with a bloody lip. Unfortunately, she didn't expect Chu Lian to grab her wrist instead, blocking her blow. Despite how slender her wrist was, she actually had quite a bit of strength in her. I would advise you to save your energy, Aunt. The look in Chu Lian's wide eyes had turned sharp. The fierce aura around her actually shocked He Ying into paralysis. Why? Why you? He Ying stuttered, but she wasn't able to continue speaking. She couldn't believe that the normally gentle, easygoing Sanlang's wife could actually be this strong. Chu Lian threw He Ying's wrist to one side, causing He Ying to stumble a few steps backwards. She bobbed towards the matriarch and said, Grandmother, it's getting late. Granddaughter-in-law won't impose on you any further. Please have a good rest. After saying so, she turned to leave. However, matriarch He slammed her cane several times in succession, making dull thuds on the floor. Now angry, she roared, Stop right there. The foot that Chu Lian had just lifted came back down again. She turned back around and looked up at the matriarch, whose face was turning as red as a pig's liver. Chu Lian cast a sideways glance at He Ying, who was showing off a gleeful glint in her eye. Chu Lian's voice was as calm as ever as she asked, Grandmother, is there something you need? So you still remember that I'm your grandmother? I thought that I was just a dying old woman in your eyes. It was the first time that matriarch He had spoken such harsh words to Chu Lian. The corners of Chu Lian's lips curved up and she laughed mockingly to herself. Granddaughter-in-law doesn't dare to bear grandmother's word. Me. What wouldn't you dare to do? If you really lacked the guts, would you have gone to Prince Wei's estate today? It must feel pretty good to have Princess Wei as your backer, huh? The remaining servants in the parlor all huddled down and tried their best to become invisible. This was the first time that the matriarch and third young madam had clashed with each other up front. One of them was the eldest member of House Jingan, The other was the young madam with both authority and power. It was hard to say who had the upper hand between these two powerhouses. Mu Xiang stood in one corner, her head lowered to hide the smile on her lips. She was clearly satisfied with Chu Lian's current situation. If something happened to matriarchy right now, regardless of whether Chu Lian was in the right, her reputation would be ruined. Once Chu Lian was deemed unvirtuous by others, coupled with how she was still childless, Mu Xiang had ways to make her leave Changdi, even if Princess Wei tried to protect her. Chu Lian took in a deep breath of the cold spring air to calm her emotions. Following that, her limpid eyes landed on Matriarch He, resolution gathering in the clear depths of her gaze. She parted her pink lips and said, "Grandmother, when are you going to wake up?" None of the people present in the parlor had expected Chu Lian to say that, let alone Matriarch He. She forgot to breathe for a moment, struggling with the weight of her fury as she glared at Chu Lian. Before anyone could react, Chu Lian continued, "Grandmother, your bias has gotten out of hand. Aunt may be your daughter and Pan Yanjun may be your granddaughter, but Isnt father your son, too? Isnt mother your daughter-in-law, and eldest brother your grandson? Can't you think more for their sake as well? House Jinggan has only had single heirs for generations." For the sake of giving birth to your 3 grandsons, mother spent all the energy in her body and fell ill. While bedridden for decades, she used her own dowry on her medicine to the point of running it dry, but she never touched a single copper coin from the estate's public fund. Hasn't she successfully opened up the branches of House Jinggan's family tree? A feat that hasn't been done in generations. And yet, how have you treated her? She only just recovered from her long-time illness, but you immediately handed over the messy public accounts for her to handle, forcing her to compensate for the accounts with her own money. If father were to find out that mother was languishing under your unfair treatment while he was out defending the borders of this country, don't you think that he would be bitterly disappointed with you? Chapter 596, Protective. 1. Eldest brother might have some responsibility to shoulder in this, but why was cousin Pan in the study of the outer court at such a late hour? If it had been second brother or my husband who was affected, would grandmother also have married Miss Pan to them? With aunt and cousin Pan's personalities, are you absolutely sure that you want Miss Pan to become eldest brother's second wife? Are you trying to bring down House Jinggan? This was what grandfather risked his life to build up. Chu Lian's words were like ferocious waves sweeping over Matriarch He. The old woman couldn't react in time, her eyes were wide and blank with shock. If these words had come from Countess Jinggan or Changdi, the matriarch wouldn't have been this shocked. However, it was Chu Lian, one of the most junior members of the family, who had said that to her. The impact was magnified by a few times. Matriarch He was instantly awakened from her muddle-headed mind. The parlor was so quiet that they could hear a pin drop. Chu Lian didn't leave right after saying her piece. She stood ramrod straight in the middle of the parlor. She had been keeping those words in for a very long time. Today, she had just vented them all out in one go, washing away the burdens weighing on her heart and lightening her mood once again. When He Ying saw that her mother's head was bowed, as if she were really considering Chu Lian's words seriously, she started to panic. She had no time to care for her pride or anything else. He Ying stepped forward with the intention to rebuke her. "Madam Chu, stop trying to confuse us with your word. What right do you have to stand there and reprimand my mother? It was bad enough that you've broken your vow of loyalty to your husband, but now you're actually trying to disrespect your elders? Your behavior is getting out of hand." He Ying was furious. She spoke whatever came to her mind without any filters. Once she finished speaking, she did feel a slight twinge of regret at some of the inappropriate accusations she had flung. However, the milk was already spilled. She couldn't take it back. "I, disloyal to my husband? I'm afraid that you must be referring to yourself instead, aunt." Chu Lian steeled her expression, managing to imitate half of He Sanlang's cold aura. While anyone might have been able to cast suspicions on Chu Lian, He Ying was actually the only one who didn't have any rights to do so. Her misdeeds during her youth were much more serious than Chu Lian's possible liaisons were. Who could have thought that the kind, easygoing third young madam would have a moment like this? She refused to give even an inch to eldest madam's bullying. He Ying had been under the matriarch's protection ever since she had come to the Jingan estate, so no one dared to retort to her. He Ying had never faced such a strong opponent before. She was about to go mad with fury. Thus, she got even more aggressive with her words. Madam Chu, don't think that I'm ignorant. You were kidnapped before in the north. A young girl, taken away by a group of barbarians. Who knows how many barbarians have already defiled you? Who knows how many green hats Sanlang is wearing now? And yet you still have the face to argue with me. Haven't you been wondering why mother doesn't like you anymore? Well, I assent it because you've disgraced our family. He Ying's mouth really knew no barriers. She had just revealed some ugly truths and even dragged the matriarch down with her. Although matriarch he had been suspecting Chu Lian's innocence, she had only been thinking of it to herself. How could she really bring it up to ask Chu Lian directly? Matriarch he was about to scold He Ying, when a tall figure quickly strode into the parlor. He Changdi shielded Chu Lian behind him. His icy eyes burned holes into He Ying, letting everyone know that he was about to flip out. Although He Sanlang usually kept a cool and aloof expression on his handsome face, he was extremely filial to his family. He always treated his family members with warmth and kindness, whether it was matriarch He, Countess Jingan, or even this aunt he didn't really like. It would have been good enough if everyone in the estate minded their own business and tried to keep the peace on the surface. However, He Ying just had to step on He Sanlang's bottom line. He Changdi was extremely overprotective of his wife. Seeing how Chu Lian had been scolded as disloyal in front of so many people, he could no longer hold back his temper. Even if his opponent was his aunt, He Ying, "Aunt, I'll advise you not to bring shame upon yourself." After saying so, he sheltered Chu Lian with one arm and quickly left Qingxi Hall. He Ying was completely shaken by He Sanlang's warning. By the time she recovered her senses, her face was warped into an ugly expression. She turned, subconsciously wanting to complain to the matriarch. She had never been shamed so badly before, especially in front of He Sanlang and Chu Lian, two younger members of the family. All the servants in the room kept as quiet as possible, trying not to draw any fire upon themselves. He Ying wailed a pitiful, "Mother," but this time, the matriarch didn't immediately answer as she normally would have. Put out by the non-response, He Ying changed her tone and made herself sob pathetically. "Mother, didn't you hear how Sanlang was slandering me just now? Sob sob. How can I continue staying here in the estate like this? That's enough." The matriarch slammed the side table, causing the teacups on it to clatter as they shook. Now He Ying was finally scared into stopping her fake cries. The self-pity she had managed to squeeze out completely faded away, leaving only shock in her eyes as she stared at her mother. "You're dismissed." "I'm tired," the matriarch said, holding a hand to her forehead as she shut her eyes and rubbed her temples. He Ying opened her mouth, wanting to speak, but under senior servant Liu's furious gaze, she abruptly turned around and stormed off. Now that her back was to the matriarch, He Ying's face twisted with disdain. He Ying had never forgotten the grudging hate she had when her parents had sent her off to Xiyang. She didn't care at all whether her mother's health would be affected by these tumultuous events. After so many harsh years in Xiyang, she had become even more selfish and self-centered. As long as she could squeeze out as much as she could from the matriarch, she wouldn't care what happened to her afterwards. Chapter 597, Protective, 2. He Changdi's face was completely black as he pulled Chu Lian with him away from Qingxi Hall. Chu Lian struggled for a bit, but she couldn't get her wrist back from his grasp. "Hubby, it won't be good for us to just leave like that." Matriarch He's expression had been terrible. If she carried any grudges from today's quarrel, then their third branch would surely be deemed unfilial. Furthermore, there was also what He Ying had said just now about her loyalty. He Changdi suddenly came to a complete stop. Chu Lian bumped into his broad back as a result. He Sanlang was as hard as a rock, so Chu Lian's poor nose and chest had suffered the consequences of their collision. If they weren't outside right now, she would have clutched her chest in pain. When He Changdi heard a gasp of pain from her, his expression warped even more. He pressed his lips together and sighed inwardly, but his tone was soft and caring as he asked, "Were you hurt?" Chu Lian bore with the pain and shook her head stiffly. Of course, He Changdi could see through her pretense thanks to her pale complexion. His silly wife always tried to soldier on without relying on him. He didn't say anything else. He let go of her wrist, bent down, and scooped her up into a bridal carry in one smooth movement. Following that, he strode quickly back to Songtao Court. Chu Lian hadn't expected any of that. When she turned back to peek at her maidservants, she realized that all of them had their heads hunkered down, pretending that they couldn't see the loving couple in front of them. A furious blush bloomed on her cheeks. She tried moving, but her little limbs were nothing to He Changdi's strong hold on her. He Sanlang simply glanced down and watched her pitiful efforts. The hand he had on her back suddenly slipped downwards to give her pert but a little pinch. She was wearing a layered dress, so her dress just managed to block He Changdi's arms. No one was able to see his actions, but Chu Lian stiffened up anyway, staring at He Sanlang in disbelief. Her eyes were accusatory and full of complaints. He Changdi's only reaction was to glance at her yet again. This time, Chu Lian didn't dare to continue struggling. She shrunk down and buried her head into He Changdi's chest, giving up on fighting her fate. Wenqing had a good guess as to what her mistress would want right now, so she dismissed the other maidservants on duty the moment they reached Songtao Court. On the way back to their bedroom, they didn't bump into that many servants. This let Chu Lian keep a little of her dignity before the servants. She heaved a sigh of relief. He Sanlang only let her down when they reached their bed. Chu Lian was carried over to the side of the bed and set down gently like a child. The maidservants on duty in the bedroom had already retreated, giving the couple some private space. He Changdi's expression was still stormy. His hands reached for the ties keeping Chu Lian's clothes together. Chu Lian suffered a fright and quickly clasped the ribbon on her clothes tightly. She glared at him with her almond-shaped eyes, extremely cautious as she said, "What are you doing?" He Sanlang blinked innocently and threw 2 cold words her way. "Checking wounds." Chu Lian was flabbergasted. She turned her body to one side, trying to dodge his hands. Her face was as flushed as it could get as she said, "I'm not hurt, you don't have to check anything. There must be something wrong with his head." She had only bumped into his back. While her chest had hurt a little at the time, it probably wasn't actually wounded. When He Sanlang saw that her neck was very red, he relaxed his expression and stopped pressing the issue. However, he held onto her shoulder while his other hand wandered up from her slender waist. In no short time, his fingers were curled around the curve of her chest, stroking and squeezing her flesh gently. The weather was becoming warmer now that spring had come, so Chu Lian had left her cotton-lined winter jackets behind for thinner spring blouses. She could feel the heat of his warm palm through the few layers of fabric covering her chest. The feeling of the cloth rubbing against her skin was rather strange. Chu Lian hadn't thought that He Changdi could keep a straight face while being so lewd in his actions. Her cheeks puffed up with anger and she gripped his palm with 2 hands, trying to push it off. "Take it off." He Changdi simply explained, "If you won't let me check, then I'll just have to examine it this way." It was too embarrassing. As he spoke, he continued moving his hand to illustrate his point. Chu Lian knew he was being completely shameless, but she couldn't find the words to refute him. She couldn't get away either. Her pitiful strength pitted against him was akin to a tiny white bunny struggling against a trap. What do you want?" They had just been in a fierce fight in Qingxi Hall. How did the air turn so lovey-dovey after they returned to Songtao Court? Even Chu Lian didn't know how things had changed so quickly. He Changdi blinked. His tone didn't change. If not for the actions of his hand, Chu Lian would have thought he had somehow become a saintly monk. Checking wounds. If Chu Lian had the freedom to flip a table right now, all the tables in the bedroom would have been appended. They had gone one round around the bush and come right back to this topic. Damn it. He Sanlang was a lunatic through and through. Chu Lian gave up. She patted his palm forcefully. Stop that. Finally, she gave him permission to check for wounds in a tiny voice. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.